At my husband Carter's company party, he smirked and shoved me into a dark hallway, warning me not to embarrass him. I quietly stepped aside, standing in the shadows, as his mistress deliberately spilled red wine all over my cheap dress. But they did not know the billionaire chairman had been watching. When he walked past the executives to take my stained hand, he whispered something that would destroy Carter's career. "I have spent 12 years looking for you. My name is Gwen, 30 years old, and for the past 5 years I have played the invisible obedient wife. Before I tell you how I brought a corrupt corporate executive to his knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like a burden by the person who was supposed to love you." 12 years ago, I was an 18-year-old data prodigy who wrote a financial algorithm that saved a major corporation. After that, I burned my digital footprint, left the tech world, and married Carter. Carter is 32, a highly ambitious portfolio manager whose fragile ego requires constant feeding. To him and his toxic family, I am just a nobody. I am the quiet wife with zero earning potential who exists purely to make his life easier. Tonight was the Gallagher Financial annual gala. Carter made it abundantly clear that my presence was a massive inconvenience to his career. We stepped into the grand ballroom. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. I wore a very simple beige dress I bought on sale because Carter restricted my household allowance, claiming he needed to invest every spare dollar. As we approached a group of executives, I tried to offer a polite smile. Carter immediately stepped in front of me, physically blocking me from the conversation. "Meet my wife, Gwen," he said to the regional director, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "She is just a stay-at-home hobbyist. She mostly organizes my schedule and keeps our house clean." The executives offered tight smiles before turning back to their discussion. I felt my face burn with humiliation, but I kept my mouth shut. This was my assigned role. A few minutes later, Carter grabbed my elbow with a harsh grip and pulled me away from the crowd into a dimly lit corridor leading toward the venue kitchens. "Listen to me very carefully," Carter hissed, his fingers digging into my arm. "My promotion to vice president is on the line tonight. I am one signature away from securing the corner office. Do not embarrass me. Just stay out of sight, do not talk to anyone important, and for God's sake stop looking so pathetic in that cheap dress." He released my arm, smoothed his lapels, and walked back into the ballroom without a backward glance. I stood alone in the shadowy hallway, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands. I was so used to swallowing my pride that his words felt entirely normal. I leaned against the flocked wallpaper, waiting for the dinner bell. That was when Sienna appeared. Sienna is 26, Carter's ambitious executive assistant. She walked down the corridor holding 2 glasses of red wine, her eyes locking onto me with a predatory gleam. As she walked past me, she deliberately tilted her wrist, sending a full glass of dark red wine splashing directly down the front of my beige dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the thin fabric, staining it a deep, ugly crimson. I gasped, stepping back against the wall in pure shock. "Oops," Sienna whispered, her voice laced with obvious venom. "Try not to look like the hired help tonight, Gwen. Carter likes women who actually belong in this room. You are just a placeholder until he gets his promotion." She gave me a sickeningly sweet smile and turned to leave. Before I could even wipe the wine from my chest, a deep, commanding voice echoed down the corridor. "What the hell is going on here?" I looked up to see Andre approaching. Andre is 35, an African-American forensic accountant, and the husband of Carter's vicious sister, Chelsea. Out of the entire toxic family I married into, Andre was the only one who possessed true integrity. He was brilliant, observant, and saw right through Carter's facade. Andre took one look at my ruined dress and Sienna's smug expression. Without a single word of hesitation, he stripped off his tailored suit jacket and draped it gently over my trembling shoulders to cover the massive stain. "Thank you, Andre," I managed to say, my voice cracking slightly. "Do not thank me," Gwen, Andre said firmly, his eyes fixed on the end of the hallway where Carter had just appeared. Carter walked toward us, laughing loudly at a joke Sienna had just made. He stopped when he saw Andre standing protectively in front of me. "Your wife was just intentionally humiliated, Carter." Andre said, his voice dangerously low. Are you going to do something about your assistant? Or do I need to speak directly to human resources tomorrow morning? Carter looked at my ruined dress, then looked at Sienna, who put on a fake apologetic pout. Instead of defending me, my husband actually chuckled. Relax, Andre Carter said dismissively, waving his hand. It was obviously an accident. Stop acting like her personal bodyguard. Gwen is perfectly fine. She was just heading to the washroom to clean up anyway. Right, Gwen. He stared at me, his eyes daring me to contradict him. I pulled Andre's jacket tighter around my stained chest. I realized in that exact moment that my marriage was not just flawed, it was completely dead. I turned my back on my husband and walked silently toward the washroom. I did not know that taking a moment to find fresh air on the balcony outside would alter the trajectory of my entire life. I pushed through the heavy glass doors leading to the grand terrace, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. The cold night air hit my face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the gala and the burning humiliation radiating from my chest. I pulled Andre's tailored suit jacket tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the damp fabric of my ruined dress clung to my skin. The city skyline stretched out before me, an endless sea of glittering lights that somehow made me feel even more isolated. I moved to the furthest, darkest corner of the balcony, hiding behind a massive potted fern. I scrubbed uselessly at the crimson wine stain with a paper towel I had grabbed from a passing tray. It was hopeless. The fabric was ruined, just like my dignity, just like the illusion of my marriage. I stared down at the dark red blotch, tracing the outline with my thumb. Carter had stood there and laughed while his mistress humiliated me. He had chosen his ambition and his ego over his wife. I closed my eyes, fighting back the hot, stinging tears that threatened to fall. I refused to cry over Carter. I refused to let his toxic world break me completely. As I stood there shivering in the shadows, I reached up and curled my fingers around the cold metal pendant resting against my collarbone. It was a habit I had formed years ago, a physical grounding mechanism whenever I felt overwhelmed. It was not a piece of traditional jewelry. It was a solid block of custom-machined titanium, intricately etched with a complex algorithmic sequence. It was a physical hardware encryption key, the only remaining relic of a past life I had buried away, to become a quiet, supportive wife. Touching the engraved metal reminded me that beneath the facade of the obedient, invisible spouse, I was still the girl who had once written code capable of bringing entire financial institutions to a grinding halt. The sound of heavy, measured footsteps interrupted my thoughts. I shrank back further into the shadows, terrified that Carter had come to drag me back inside to face more humiliation. But the figure that emerged into the soft glow of the terrace lights was not my husband. It was an older man, tall and imposing, wearing a masterfully tailored tuxedo. His silver hair caught the ambient light, and his sharp, intelligent eyes surveyed the city skyline. I recognized him instantly. It was Winston Gallagher, the billionaire chairman of Gallagher Financial, the man whose approval Carter obsessed over daily. Winston let out a long, weary sigh, loosening his bow tie slightly. He seemed to carry the weight of a massive empire on his shoulders. He turned toward the railing, and as he moved, he finally noticed me standing quietly in the corner. He stopped, his expression shifting from surprise to immediate concern, as he took in my shivering frame, the oversized suit jacket, and the massive dark stain covering my dress. "I am so sorry," I stammered, stepping back toward the glass doors. "I was just leaving. I did not mean to intrude on your space, Mr. Gallagher." "Wait, please do not go on my account," Winston said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his immense power. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a pristine white handkerchief, extending his hand toward me. "Here, take this. It looks like you have had a rather unfortunate evening." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping out of the shadows to accept the handkerchief. "Thank you," I murmured, pressing the soft linen against my ruined dress. It was a futile gesture, but I appreciated his kindness. It was a stark contrast to the cruelty I had just endured from my own husband. "Are you quite all right?" Winston asked, his sharp eyes assessing me with genuine empathy. Corporate galas can be treacherous environments. I saw what happened in the hallway. That young assistant was remarkably careless. I swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze. Yes, careless. Thank you for your concern, sir. I am fine. I am just Carter's wife. Gwen. I am nobody important. Winston frowned slightly, clearly unsettled by my self-deprecating introduction. A man's worth is not determined by his title, and a woman's value is certainly not defined by her husband's position. As he spoke, a sudden gust of wind blew across the terrace. I shivered violently, and Andre's jacket slipped off my shoulders, exposing the neckline of my dress. The titanium pendant resting against my skin caught the overhead terrace light gleaming sharply in the darkness. Winston's eyes dropped to the necklace. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. I watched his entire demeanor change in a matter of seconds. The relaxed, empathetic billionaire vanished, replaced by a man struck by lightning. His face drained of color, turning a shocking ashen pale. He stepped closer to me, entirely ignoring social decorum, his eyes locked onto the solid block of metal with terrifying intensity. "Where did you get that?" Winston demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I stepped back, startled by his sudden intensity. My hand instinctively flew up to cover the pendant. "It is just a necklace," I lied, my heart rate accelerating. "I bought it years ago." "No, you did not buy that," Winston stated, taking another step forward until he was standing mere inches away from me. "Let me see it. Please." Reluctantly, I lowered my hand. Winston leaned in, squinting at the intricate microscopic engraving etched into the side of the titanium block. He traced the algorithmic sequence with his eyes, reading the complex mathematical logic that I had burned into the metal 12 years prior. He was a brilliant man, a pioneer in financial technology, and I knew the exact second his brain translated the code. "This is a rolling cipher encryption key." Winston breathed, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. "And that engraving? That is a variable matrix sequence. It is the signature bypass architecture used to stabilize the Gallagher core servers during the massive cyber intrusion 12 years ago." My breath caught in my throat. Nobody was supposed to know that. Nobody knew the details of that night except the anonymous coder who had intercepted the attack and the chairman whose empire had been saved. I froze, unable to formulate a lie, unable to deny the truth standing right in front of me. I had buried my identity so completely that I thought the past was dead. But Winston Gallagher was looking at me like he had just seen a ghost. "You wrote this," Winston said, his voice shaking with an emotion I could not quite place. "The cipher logic matches the exact patch notes. You are the architect. You are Ghost Protocol." I tried to step away, to run back into the crowded ballroom and disappear, but my legs refused to move. I was exposed. The brilliant, fearless girl I used to be was suddenly standing naked in the light, trapped inside the body of a humiliated, discarded housewife. "Mr. Gallagher, please," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the glass doors. "You must be mistaken. I am just a portfolio manager's wife. I do not know anything about your servers." Winston did not hear my denial. He was entirely consumed by the realization. 12 years ago, an unknown prodigy had accessed his collapsing financial mainframe, rewritten the firewall architecture in 3 hours, saved billions of dollars in client assets, and then vanished without a trace, leaving only a digital signature and a piece of encrypted code. Now that same code was hanging around the neck of a woman standing on his balcony, shivering in a wine-stained dress. Tears suddenly welled in the corners of Winston's eyes. The powerful, untouchable chairman of Gallagher Financial looked completely overwhelmed. He reached out his hands, trembling slightly, and gently grasped my right hand. His grip was firm, grounding, and filled with a desperate, overwhelming sense of relief. He looked directly into my eyes, seeing straight past the ruined dress, past the meek facade I had worn for half a decade straight, into the core of who I truly was. "I have spent 12 years looking for you." Before I could even process the magnitude of Winston Gallagher's words, the heavy glass doors leading to the terrace swung violently open. The loud crash echoed against the brick walls, shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment. I flinched, pulling my hand away from the chairman's gentle grip just as Carter stormed onto the balcony. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and his jaw was locked in absolute fury. He had noticed my absence from the ballroom and came looking for me only to find his supposedly pathetic, embarrassing wife standing in a dark corner holding hands with the billionaire owner of the entire company. Carter's fragile ego could not process the reality of the situation. His blinding ambition and inherent insecurity caused his mind to completely snap. In his twisted perspective, there was only one impossible, horrifying conclusion. He believed I had deliberately cornered the chairman to complain, to beg for attention, or worse, to somehow ruin his carefully orchestrated career trajectory just out of spite. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides. Ignoring every rule of corporate decorum he usually worshipped, Carter seized my upper arm with a bruising, relentless grip and yanked me forcefully behind him like a disobedient child. "Mr. Gallagher, I am so incredibly sorry." Carter stammered, his voice dripping with a sickening blend of panic, fear, and forced subservience. "My wife has clearly had too much to drink. She can be highly unstable and completely lacks social boundaries. I apologize profusely that she bothered you with her nonsense tonight." Winston blinked, clearly stunned by the sudden violence and the blatant disrespect Carter displayed. The billionaire took a step forward, raising a hand to intervene. "Carter, stop. You completely misunderstand the situation. Gwen and I were just having a very important conversation." But Carter was entirely deaf to reason. The sheer terror of losing his impending promotion to vice president had triggered a blind panic attack. He refused to let the chairman finish his sentence, convinced that Winston was simply being polite to a deranged spouse to avoid a public scene. "I assure you, sir, it will never happen again," Carter interrupted loudly, pulling me toward the glass doors with enough force that I nearly stumbled over my own feet. "We are leaving immediately. Please enjoy the rest of your evening and forgive this tremendous embarrassment." Before Winston could utter another word, Carter dragged me back into the glaring lights of the venue. The walk through the gala was a humiliating blur. I kept my head bowed, my face burning with fresh shame, as Carter marched us past his colleagues, his fingers digging into my arm like iron claws. I did not struggle. I knew better than to ignite a public screaming match with a raging narcissist. We reached the valet stand in record time. Carter shoved me into the passenger seat of our car before slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows in their frames. The drive home was suffocating. The air inside the vehicle felt heavy, thick with an unspoken, volatile rage that threatened to explode at any second. Neither of us said a word for 20 solid minutes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Carter aggressively gripping the leather steering wheel and breathing heavily through his nose. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into the dark, quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood. My arm throbbed where he had grabbed me, but the physical pain was secondary to the chilling realization that the man beside me was a complete monster. The exact moment he parked the car in our driveway and killed the engine, the dam broke entirely. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Carter exploded, slamming his fists violently against the steering wheel. His voice bounced aggressively around the confined space of the car, making my ears ring. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You threw yourself at the chairman of the board. You deliberately tracked down Winston Gallagher to seduce him or humiliate me or whatever sick, twisted game you are playing in your head." "Carter, you are insane," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I did not throw myself at anyone. I was standing alone in the dark, trying to clean the wine Sienna spilled on me. He came outside for fresh air. He recognized a necklace I was wearing. "That is it." "Do not lie to me," he screamed, turning his entire body to face me with absolute disgust. "You are jealous. You have always been jealous of my success. You sit at home all day doing absolutely nothing with your life, and you could not stand the fact that tonight was about my achievements. You had to sabotage my promotion. You had to make sure the executive board thinks I am married to a desperate, unhinged liability." He threw his door open and marched toward the house. I followed him inside, maintaining my composure. I had spent 5 years shrinking myself to fit into his narrow worldview, suppressing my intellect to make him feel like the smartest person in the room. But tonight, The illusion had cracked completely. Carter stormed directly into our master bedroom. I watched from the doorway as his narcissistic rage reached a fever pitch. He kicked a wooden chair out of his way, walked straight into my closet, and dragged out my medium travel suitcase. He unzipped it violently on the bed and began pulling my clothes off the hangers in massive handfuls. He threw dresses, sweaters, and shoes into the bag in a haphazard, chaotic pile, destroying everything in his path. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping further into the room. "I am fixing the problem," he snarled, forcing the overstuffed suitcase shut and aggressively yanking the zipper. He grabbed the handle, marched past me, and headed straight for the front door. I followed him down the hallway, confusion and burning anger finally warring in my chest. He yanked the heavy oak door open and hurled my suitcase onto the front lawn. It tumbled across the damp grass, bursting open and stopping just short of the sidewalk. The digital clock on the hallway console read exactly 2 in the morning. A bitter, freezing wind blew into the foyer, cutting right through my ruined dress. "Get out," Carter commanded, pointing a shaking finger toward the dark street. "You cannot do this, Carter. It is 2 o'clock in the morning and it is freezing outside. I have nowhere to go. I can do whatever I want." He snapped, his eyes cold and entirely devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "You are a massive liability to my career, Gwen. You contribute nothing to this household, and tonight you actively tried to destroy my entire future. I am done dealing with your pathetic attempts for attention." He stepped back inside the house, grabbing the edge of the heavy door. "You can come back only when you learn how to be a proper, invisible wife. Until then, stay out of my sight." He slammed the door directly in my face. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, final echo. I stood on the concrete porch in the freezing night air, wearing a cheap, wine-stained dress, staring at my clothes scattered across the lawn. The biting wind cut straight through the thin fabric of my ruined dress. I stood perfectly still on the manicured grass of our front lawn, staring at the heavy oak door that had just slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked loudly in the silent night, finalizing my sudden eviction. At 2 in the morning, the upscale suburban street was completely deserted. The only sound was the distant hum of highway traffic and the rustle of dry leaves scraping across the pavement. I dropped to my knees on the damp grass and began blindly shoving my scattered clothes back into the suitcase. My hands were completely numb. Carter had thrown my belongings with such force that a few blouses had landed in the wet mulch near the rose bushes. I moved like a machine, refusing to cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a safety net. I had absolutely nothing. Just as I zipped the broken luggage shut, a sharp vibration against my hip startled me. I pulled my phone from the hidden pocket of my dress. The screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a new text message. It was from Andre. The message was brief but urgent. "Carter looked completely unhinged when he dragged you out of the hotel. I followed his car. Are you safe?" I stared at the glowing letters, my frozen fingers fumbling over the keypad. "He locked me out," I typed back. "I am freezing on the sidewalk." The response was instantaneous. "Stay right there. I am turning onto your street now." Less than 2 minutes later, a set of bright headlights swept across the manicured lawns of our pristine neighborhood. Andre's heavy black SUV pulled up to the curb, idling quietly. The passenger door swung open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. I grabbed my battered suitcase and hurried across the damp grass. The blast of warm air from the car interior hit me the moment I climbed inside, bringing an involuntary shudder to my entire body. Andre reached over, took the suitcase from my shaking hands, and tossed it into the back seat. He did not ask any pointless questions. He took one look at my pale face, the massive wine stains still covering my chest and my trembling shoulders, and immediately shifted the car into gear. We drove in absolute silence for a long time, navigating the empty, dark streets of the city. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:30. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, watching the streetlights blur past. I expected Andre to take me to a hotel, or perhaps to the massive estate he shared with Carter's toxic sister Chelsea. Instead, he drove toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. He pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of an all-night diner. It was the kind of place with buzzing neon signs, cracked vinyl booths, and a lingering smell of old coffee. It was entirely isolated, far away from the polished, wealthy world of Gallagher Financial. It was perfect for a private conversation. We grabbed a corner booth near the back of the restaurant. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the deep exhaustion lining Andre's face. He ordered a pot of black coffee for both of us. When the waitress walked away, leaving us in the quiet hum of the empty diner, Andre leaned forward and folded his hands on the sticky laminate table. He looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I did not just follow you tonight because Carter was acting like a lunatic at the gala. He began, his voice barely above a whisper. I have been watching Carter very closely for the last 4 months. I needed to wait until he pushed you away completely before I made my move. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words through the thick layer of exhaustion. Your move, I asked, wrapping my cold hands tightly around the thick ceramic coffee mug. What exactly are you talking about, Andre? He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and withdrew a small, sleek black flash drive. He placed it carefully on the table directly between our coffee cups. It sat there like a loaded weapon. As a forensic accountant, it is my job to track missing money. Andre explained, his eyes locking onto mine to ensure I was listening. When my wife Chelsea suddenly started remodeling her luxury boutique and buying high-end designer inventory with cash she absolutely did not have, I started quietly pulling her business ledgers. Chelsea is extremely arrogant, but she is not smart enough to hide stolen money properly. She left a paper trail a mile wide. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Chelsea's boutique had always been a failing vanity project, a massive money pit that Carter frequently bragged about bailing out with his own bonuses. I traced the sudden influx of cash backward. Andre continued, his voice tight with suppressed righteous anger. It did not come from a legitimate business loan. It came from a complex series of offshore shell companies, and those shell companies are directly linked to Carter's specific portfolio department at Gallagher Financial. I sat perfectly still, the steam from the hot coffee warming my frozen face. Carter is not just a narcissistic bully, Gwen. He is a criminal. He and Sienna are not just sleeping together. The affair is just the tip of the iceberg. They are actively using their executive access codes to aggressively embezzle millions of dollars directly from Gallagher's high-tier client funds. They systematically siphon the money into those untraceable shell accounts, and then Chelsea launders it straight through her luxury boutique by creating fake inventory invoices and phantom sales records. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me in a massive wave. My husband had brutally discarded me on the street because he truly believed I was a pathetic liability to his pristine career. He called me a stay-at-home hobbyist. He demanded I remain invisible, all while he was orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar corporate fraud with his mistress and his vicious sister. He was actively stealing from Winston Gallagher, the very chairman he bowed down to just hours ago. I looked down at the small black flash drive resting on the scratch table. That drive contains every single illegal ledger, every routed offshore IP address, and every forged authorization signature I could safely recover, Andre said quietly. It is undeniable concrete proof of their embezzlement ring, but I cannot take it to the federal authorities myself yet. If I blow the whistle right now, Chelsea destroys the remaining evidence, she goes to federal prison, and my children are dragged through a horrific media circus. I need someone on the inside to lock them down first. Someone Carter would never ever suspect. Someone who understands complex data architecture and can trigger an absolute system freeze from within Gallagher Financial without leaving a single digital fingerprint. Andre looked down at the custom-machined titanium pendant still hanging around my neck. He knew. He had seen the interaction on the balcony with Winston. He knew exactly what I was truly capable of. I slowly reached out and picked up the flash drive, feeling its solid, heavy weight in my palm. The freezing cold from the front lawn was entirely gone, replaced by a burning razor-sharp focus I had not felt in 5 long years. I slipped the drive into my pocket, feeling its rigid plastic edges, against the damp fabric of my ruined dress. Andre paid the diner tab, his expression a mix of relief and grim determination. He drove me to a dilapidated neon-lit motel on the extreme outskirts of the industrial district, far off Carter's radar. Andre paid the front desk clerk in cash for 3 nights, ensuring there was absolutely no credit card trail for my husband to follow or intercept. We parted ways in the cracked asphalt parking lot with a silent, affirming nod, an unspoken pact of warfare sealed between us. I locked the flimsy wooden door of room 12, pulled the heavy security chain into place, and curled up on the scratchy, faded bedspread. I did not sleep a single wink. My mind was already decoding the infinite possibilities, compiling a mental framework of attack to systematically dismantle Carter's entire stolen empire. At 8 in the morning, a sharp, authoritative knock rattled the thin door in its frame. I jumped from the bed, my hand instinctively going to my pocket, where the flash drive rested safely. I crept toward the window and peered through the broken plastic blinds. Parked right next to the rusted ice machine was a pristine black, heavily armored town car. 2 men in dark tailored suits stood nearby, scanning the empty, trash-strewn lot with clinical precision. Standing directly on my welcome mat, checking his silver pocket watch, was Winston Gallagher. I unbolted the door and pulled it open, bracing myself for the sudden rush of morning smog. The billionaire chairman of Gallagher Financial looked completely out of place, standing on the cracked concrete walkway. He wore a different bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, but the exact same intense, desperate look from the balcony remained etched deeply into his features. "May I come in?" Winston asked, his voice steady, but carrying an underlying, unmistakable urgency. I stepped aside, gesturing to the cramped, outdated room with its flickering overhead light. He walked in, seemingly unbothered by the peeling floral wallpaper and the lingering smell of stale cigarette smoke. He took a seat at the small, wobbly laminate table near the window, gesturing for me to sit opposite him. I pulled up the remaining plastic chair, crossing my arms defensively over my chest, waiting for him to state his business. "How did you find me?" I asked, keeping my tone strictly guarded. "When you realize you have just spoken to the most brilliant data architect of the decade, you do not simply let her walk away into the night," Winston replied, his sharp eyes meeting mine with absolute conviction. "I had my personal security detail run the license plate of the SUV that picked you up from your neighborhood sidewalk. Once I identified Andre, tracing his movements to this particular motel was elementary. I apologize for the extreme intrusion, Gwen, but we do not have time for pleasantries. My company is bleeding out." He leaned forward, placing a sleek leather portfolio onto the scratched laminate surface. "For the past 3 quarters, we have been hemorrhaging capital from our top-tier client funds. The financial anomaly is massive, but it is buried beneath layers of ghost code so incredibly sophisticated that my entire cybersecurity division is completely blind to it. Whoever is siphoning this money is operating inside my house using my own digital infrastructure against me. They are rerouting millions through untraceable offshore channels, and if we do not plug the leak before the upcoming quarterly board audit, federal regulators will tear Gallagher Financial apart piece by piece." Winston unzipped the portfolio and withdrew a single crisp slip of bank paper. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a solid gold fountain pen, and signed his name at the bottom with a flourish. He did not write a number. He simply slid the blank check across the table until it rested right in front of my folded hands. "I need Ghost Protocol," he said, his voice dropping to a low, pleading register. "Name your exact price. 5 million. 10 million. Whatever it takes to get you back into the corporate tech world, I will pay it right now without a single question. Fix my servers, find the security leak, and save my company from total ruin." I stared down at the blank check. 5 years ago, a piece of paper like that would have felt like a miraculous lottery ticket. Yesterday, before the spilled wine, the public humiliation, and the freezing front lawn, I might have felt wildly unworthy of such a staggering offer. But sitting in this dingy motel room, with Andre's flash drive burning a hole in my pocket, the money meant absolutely nothing to me. Carter had stripped away my dignity, my home, and my voice. A massive payout would not give those things back. I did not want a quiet, wealthy exit. I wanted absolute, unapologetic destruction. I placed my index finger firmly on the edge of the blank check and slowly pushed it back across the table toward the billionaire. "I do not want your money, Winston," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute certainty that startled even me. "I want authority." Winston blinked, looking down at the rejected check and then back up at my face. His thick brow furrowed in genuine, fascinated intrigue. "What exactly are you asking for, Gwen?" I leaned forward, mirroring his intense businesslike posture. "I want to be hired immediately as the chief risk officer of Gallagher Financial. But I will not be a public face to the employees. I want the position to be entirely anonymous. On paper, and to the rest of the corporate hierarchy, I will simply be known as the architect. I will answer to absolutely no one except you and the executive board of directors." Winston remained silent, absorbing the heavy weight of my demands, but I was nowhere near finished. Furthermore, I continued my tone, leaving zero room for negotiation or compromise. "I require unrestricted total audit access to every single department secure server and private ledger inside your entire corporation. I want the highest level of administrative security clearance available on the mainframe. I will accept no red tape, no departmental pushback, and no middle manager approvals. I want the immediate power to freeze corporate accounts, seize digital assets, and lock out any executive I deem suspicious. And I want my very first highly aggressive forensic audit to be heavily and specifically focused on Carter's portfolio management division." I sat back in my cheap plastic chair, waiting for him to laugh out loud to tell me my terms were completely outrageous for a woman who had been out of the industry for 5 long years. Instead, a slow, highly predatory smile spread across Winston Gallagher's weathered face. He saw exactly what was happening in this room. He recognized the ruthless, calculated fire in my eyes, the exact same fire that had allowed an 18-year-old girl to rewrite his entire security matrix 12 years ago. He did not need to know the sordid, miserable details of my marriage to understand that I was about to become the most dangerous weapon in his entire corporate arsenal. He picked up his gold fountain pen, capped it smoothly, and placed it back into his tailored jacket. He picked up the blank check, tore it precisely in half, and let the pieces flutter into the small trash can beside the desk. "You have a deal, Madam Chief Risk Officer," Winston said, extending his hand across the table to formalize our agreement. "Your executive access codes and secure remote servers will be fully active by noon today. Welcome back to the game." I took his hand, sealing the pact with a firm, unyielding grip. The quiet, invisible wife was officially dead. The architect had just been hired, and Carter was completely unaware that the invisible force about to rip his professional and personal world apart was the very woman he had thrown onto the street. I spent the remainder of the morning transforming the small, outdated motel desk into a secure digital command center. Andre had quietly dropped off a pair of heavily encrypted laptops, and Winston had delivered on his promise with terrifying speed. By noon, I was fully integrated into the Gallagher Financial mainframe, my administrative credentials granting me absolute invisible access to every hidden corner of the corporate network. I was deep into parsing the initial layers of Carter's portfolio architecture when a sharp, persistent buzzing broke my concentration. It was the temporary burner phone Andre had provided me. The caller ID was blocked, but the moment I answered, the shrill, vindictive voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Chelsea. My sister-in-law had never bothered to hide her disdain for me, but today she sounded utterly euphoric. "I hope you are enjoying whatever roach-infested gutter you slept in last night," Chelsea sneered, not even bothering with a greeting. "Carter told me everything. I have to say, Gwen, it is about time he finally took out the trash. Sienna is already at the house looking at new paint swatches for the master bedroom. It turns out my brother prefers a woman who actually belongs in our tax bracket, not some pathetic homeless college dropout playing house." I kept my breathing steady, staring at the cascading lines of Gallagher's secure financial code running across my monitors. Chelsea's boutique was currently functioning as the primary laundering hub for Carter's stolen millions, making her gloating almost comical. "What do you want, Chelsea?" I asked, pitching my voice to sound appropriately defeated and exhausted. I knew she was recording the call, hoping to capture me begging or crying. "I am just doing my brother a favor by giving you a heads up," she said, her tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Carter is sending his legal representation to your location right now. Do not try to fight the settlement, Gwen. You have absolutely no money, no leverage, and no future. Just sign the papers and disappear. It is the only smart thing you can possibly do." She hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down and took a deep, calming breath. The timing was perfect. I quickly minimized my secure connection to the Gallagher servers, closed the encrypted laptops, and shoved them out of sight beneath the motel bed. I messed up my hair, pulled the oversized suit jacket tightly around my shoulders, and waited. 10 minutes later, a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the thin door. I opened it to find a tall, impeccably dressed man holding a thick leather briefcase. He surveyed the peeling paint and cracked concrete of the motel exterior with blatant disgust before his cold eyes locked onto me. "Gwen," he stated, his voice flat and clinical. "I am Sterling Vance, senior partner at Vance and Associates. I represent your husband. May I come in?" I stepped aside, playing the part of the broken, humiliated wife perfectly. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze lowered, projecting an aura of total defeat. Sterling walked into the cramped room, refusing to sit on the stained floral bedspread or the cheap plastic chair. Instead, he placed his briefcase on the wobbly table, snapped the latches open, and produced a dense stack of legal documents. "Carter instructed me to make this as swift and painless as possible," Sterling said, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. "This is a comprehensive dissolution of marriage. Given the brevity of your union and your current employment status, Carter is offering a clean break. However, you need to understand the reality of your situation." He flipped to the third page, pointing a manicured finger at a highlighted paragraph. The contract was a masterpiece of legal predation. It systematically stripped away every single marital asset we shared. "As clearly outlined here?" Sterling continued, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "The firm has classified your contribution to the marital estate as negligible. The contract explicitly cites your zero earning potential over the last 5 years. You are not entitled to alimony, spousal support, or any division of the primary residence, which was purchased solely with Carter's corporate bonuses. You will receive exactly what you brought into this marriage, which is nothing." I let my lower lip tremble slightly, staring at the harsh legal jargon. It was brutally unfair, entirely one-sided, and precisely what I wanted. Carter was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to clear the path for Sienna that he believed he held all the power. He wanted to crush me completely, leaving me destitute. "It is incredibly thorough," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the paper. "I understand Carter wants to move on, but if I am walking away with absolutely nothing, I need one small assurance for my own peace of mind. I will sign this right now without dragging him into a messy court battle on one strict condition." Sterling sighed heavily, checking his expensive watch. He clearly viewed me as a minor nuisance standing between him and a lucrative billable hour. "What exactly do you want?" "I need a liability clause added to the final page," I said, looking up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Carter manages massive amounts of money, and his lifestyle is very expensive. If I have zero earning potential and no assets, I cannot be held responsible if he made mistakes. I want a deeply specific indemnification clause stating that Carter assumes absolute and sole responsibility for any undeclared hidden debts, corporate penalties, or legal financial restitutions discovered post-divorce." Sterling stared at me for a long moment. In the realm of standard divorce proceedings, it sounded like the paranoid request of a naive housewife terrified of being saddled with secret credit card debt or an unpaid luxury car lease. He could not possibly fathom that I was actively referring to the tens of millions of dollars Carter was currently embezzling from Gallagher Financial. When the federal hammer inevitably fell, the corporate penalties and legal restitutions would be catastrophic. By signing that specific clause, Carter would forfeit any ability to claim the stolen money was a shared marital asset, or attempt to force me to shoulder half of the federal repayment burden. He would be trapped carrying the entire financial weight of his crimes alone. "It is a standard protective measure," Sterling muttered, pulling out a legal pad to draft the amendment. "It is highly unnecessary given Carter's impeccable financial standing, but if it gets your signature on these papers today, I will facilitate it." Sterling stepped outside into the smoggy air to call Carter and get verbal authorization for the amendment. I watched through the blinds as the lawyer spoke into his phone, nodding briskly. Carter was likely so eager to be rid of me and so utterly convinced of his own invincibility that he probably did not even bother to process the wording. Less than 5 minutes later, Sterling returned to the room. "He has agreed," Sterling said, typing the amendment into a digital copy of the contract on his tablet and connecting it to a portable wireless printer from his briefcase. The printer whirred, spitting out the revised final page. He slid the fresh document and the silver pen across the scratch table toward me. "Sign at the bottom and initial the addendum." I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. I signed my name with fluid, perfect precision, binding Carter entirely to the devastating financial fallout of his own arrogance. I handed the paperwork back to Sterling, who snatched it up triumphantly, snapping his briefcase shut. "A wise decision," Gwen Sterling remarked coldly as he headed for the door. "Good luck with your future endeavors." The door clicked shut behind him. I stood alone in the quiet room, a genuine, terrifying smile finally breaking across my face. Carter believed he had just finalized my absolute ruin. He was entirely unaware that he had just signed his own professional and financial death warrant. I walked over to the bed, pulled the encrypted Gallagher laptops out from their hiding spot, and flipped the screens open. The ambush was over, and the execution was about to begin. I sat cross-legged on the faded motel bedspread, the glow from the dual encrypted laptops casting long shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. Winston Gallagher had kept his word with terrifying efficiency. My newly minted administrative credentials granted me an absolute godlike view of the entire corporate network. There was no departmental red tape, no firewalls I could not bypass, and no digital corner where a secret could hide. I was officially in the system. The corporate directory simply listed my access node under a blank, unclickable profile. To the rest of the executive board and the thousands of employees operating downtown, I was a ghost. I was the architect. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a familiar, exhilarating rhythm taking over. The rust of a 5-year hiatus vanished instantly, replaced by muscle memory and a cold, calculating precision. I bypassed the standard employee monitoring protocols and dove straight into the deep architecture of the high-tier client portfolios. This was the exact sector Carter managed the division he so proudly boasted about at dinner parties while belittling my existence. Utilizing the raw data from Andre's flash drive, I mapped out the massive labyrinth of offshore shell companies and phantom accounts Carter and Sienna had constructed. It was a remarkably arrogant setup. They had relied heavily on the sheer volume of daily corporate transactions to mask their theft, skimming millions through microscopic automated transfers that fed directly into the accounts tied to Chelsea's luxury boutique. They believed they were untouchable. They believed the old bypass codes Carter had established years ago would forever shield them from internal audits. They were wrong. I did not just want to block their access. I wanted to trigger a catastrophic, undeniable panic. I opened a clean command terminal and began writing a bespoke containment algorithm. It was a digital bear trap designed to remain completely dormant until the exact moment they attempted their next scheduled transfer. I injected the code directly into the root directory of their primary slush fund routing protocol. I linked the algorithm to every single offshore account associated with their embezzlement ring. I did not delete the money. I froze it entirely, placing millions of dollars in a state of absolute digital purgatory where it could neither be accessed, transferred, nor hidden. I executed the command. A green confirmation bar flashed across my left monitor. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait. I opened a secondary window, pulling up the live activity logs for Carter's specific terminal and Sienna's adjacent workstation. The digital footprint of Gallagher Financial was a living, breathing entity on my screen, and I was monitoring its pulse. The morning trading hours ticked by. I drank terrible motel coffee and watched the data streams cascade in real time. At precisely 10:14 in the morning, the system alert flared bright red on my dashboard. Carter had initiated the transfer. He was attempting to route a massive sum of client dividends into the primary Cayman Shell account right on schedule. The moment his terminal sent the execution command, my algorithm snapped its jaws shut. I watched the server logs light up like a fireworks display as the transaction hit a concrete wall. The system instantly returned a fatal error code. Access denied. Funds frozen. Pending executive audit. I leaned closer to the screen, a predatory thrill rushing through my veins. The activity log on Carter's terminal suddenly spiked with frantic, chaotic inputs. He was refreshing the page, hitting execution overrides, and furiously typing commands into the interface. I could easily picture the scene unfolding miles away in his pristine glass office. Carter would be loosening his silk tie, his jaw clenched, staring at the flashing red text that defied his authority. He was used to bullying his way through every obstacle, barking orders at subordinates until the world bent to his will. But he could not bully a line of code. He was trying to force the illegal transfer through utterly unaware that every single keystroke was triggering further quarantine protocols and cementing his guilt into the permanent server history. Seconds later, Sienna's workstation pinged. He had clearly called his mistress over in a blind panic. Her terminal access codes flooded the log as she attempted to bypass the block from her side of the department. They were working together now, their digital fingerprints verifying everything Andre had suspected and providing me with irrefutable time-stamped evidence. They were desperately attempting to use their old reliable backdoor bypass keys, the specific administrative codes they had relied on to stay invisible for months. I smiled, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. I let them sweat. I let them struggle for exactly 2 minutes, allowing the sheer suffocating terror of the situation to fully sink into their arrogant minds. They were watching tens of millions of stolen dollars sit entirely out of their reach, flagged for a high-level corporate audit they could not manipulate or stop. The very money they had planned to use to fund their luxurious new life was now the exact evidence that would send them to federal prison. Then I delivered the final decisive blow. I bypassed their local terminals entirely and executed a hard system-wide override directly from my ghost node. I watched the data streams as every single application on Carter's dual monitors forcibly closed. The system systematically stripped his executive trading privileges, revoked his offshore access, and instantly locked his terminal down to a basic read-only status. I mirrored the exact protocol on Sienna's workstation. I severed their connection to the outside world, locking them out of the very financial ecosystem they thought they controlled. A final automated message generated by my algorithm flashed across both of their screens simultaneously. Security breach detected. Administrative lockout engaged. Do not close this terminal. The activity logs on my end went completely dead. Their keyboards were disabled. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark motel room. Back at the gleaming glass tower of Gallagher Financial, Carter and Sienna were sitting at their dead terminals, the blood draining from their faces, cold sweat soaking through their expensive clothes. Their bypass codes were useless. Their stolen money was frozen. They were entirely stripped of their power in the middle of a crowded trading floor. For the first time in their miserable, arrogant lives, they finally realized the terrifying truth. The system was not glitching. They were not dealing with a standard IT error. An invisible, omnipotent force inside the company was actively hunting them, and they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The invisible wife had just taken total control of the board. The invisible wife had just taken total control of the board. I allowed myself exactly 1 minute to bask in the adrenaline of the successful digital strike before my burner phone vibrated against the laminate desk. It was an encrypted text message from Andre containing a set of GPS coordinates and a timestamp for 2 hours from now. I immediately logged off the Gallagher mainframe, cleared my temporary cache, and slipped out of the dingy motel room into the overcast afternoon. The coordinates led me to the subterranean parking structure of a defunct shopping mall on the edge of the city limits. The cavernous concrete expanse was devoid of life, lit only by the sporadic sickly yellow glow of dying sodium lamps. I parked my rented sedan in the deepest corner of the lowest level, the tires crunching loudly over discarded gravel. A few moments later, a nondescript gray sedan pulled into the spot directly adjacent to mine. The engine cut off, and Andre stepped out into the dim light. He looked noticeably different from the man who had picked me up on the frozen lawn. The tailored suits and polished veneer of the wealthy brother-in-law were gone, replaced by a dark windbreaker and the exhausted, hardened posture of a man bracing for war. He walked over, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage, and handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. "This is the final piece of the puzzle," Andre said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "I spent the last 48 hours digging through the physical files Chelsea keeps locked in her home office safe. What Carter and Sienna were doing on the corporate side is nothing compared to the brazen criminality of my wife's boutique operations." I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of dense, highly detailed financial ledgers. I flipped through the pages, my eyes rapidly scanning the columns of numbers. Chelsea owned a high-end luxury fashion boutique in the city center, a business she constantly flaunted as proof of her superior entrepreneurial skills. According to these private ledgers, the boutique was generating impossible margins. The inventory purchase orders were microscopic, yet the daily cash deposits and incoming wire transfers from anonymous offshore entities were staggering. "She is not selling designer handbags," I murmured, tracing a manicured finger over a massive deposit listed under a fabricated vendor name. "She is washing Carter's stolen corporate funds." Andre nodded grimly, leaning against the cold concrete pillar. "They established a closed-loop system. Carter siphons the money out of Gallagher Financial using his offshore ghost accounts and then routes those specific funds directly into Chelsea's boutique under the guise of international luxury goods sales. The boutique claims the stolen money as legitimate retail revenue, pays the standard corporate tax rate, and then filters the completely washed cash straight into Carter's private domestic holdings. Chelsea gets a massive percentage off the top for facilitating the laundry cycle. It is a highly coordinated, incredibly arrogant criminal enterprise." I looked up from the ledger, studying Andre's face. The pain in his eyes was palpable, a deep, resonant grief mixed with absolute revulsion. He had married Chelsea believing in a partnership, only to discover he was sharing his life with a vapid, greedy criminal. "I am disgusted by her," Gwen Andre confessed, his voice trembling with a contained fury. "I always knew she was materialistic and deeply selfish. I tolerated her snide remarks and her elitist attitude because I wanted to keep our family intact. But digging through these files, reading her private communications with Carter, I saw the absolute truth of who she really is. Her greed is bottomless. And the way she spoke about you, the sheer unapologetic racism and vitriol she used to describe your background and your struggles, it made me physically sick to my stomach. She truly believes that because of her bank account, the laws of basic human decency do not apply to her." He paced a few steps away, running a hand over his face. "I cannot let my children grow up in that toxic environment. I refuse to let my kids be raised by a woman who views human beings as disposable assets and laws as mere suggestions for the lower classes." I placed the ledgers securely back into the manila envelope. "What is your next move, Andre?" He turned back to face me, his jaw set with an absolute resolve. "I have already retained the most aggressive family law attorney in the state. I am filing for immediate sole physical and legal custody of our children. But more importantly, I am not keeping this internal." Chelsea and Carter crossed the line from marital betrayals into federal felonies. Andre reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to me. It bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. "I had an introductory meeting with a federal agent this morning." Andre revealed, his tone deadly serious. "I invoked whistleblower protection and handed over a preliminary summary of the boutique's laundering front. The feds have been looking for a reason to audit Carter's division for months, but they lacked the specific internal evidence to secure a warrant. These ledgers, combined with the digital footprint you are currently gathering from the Gallagher mainframe, will give them everything they need to launch a full-scale raid. I looked down at the federal agent's card, feeling the immense gravity of the situation locking into place. The board was fully set. I had Carter trapped in a digital cage inside his own firm, and Andre was preparing to drop a federal anvil on his head from the outside. "We need to synchronize our strikes," I said, looking Andre directly in the eyes. Carter currently knows he is locked out of his funds, but he thinks it is a temporary corporate glitch or an internal security sweep. He does not know I am the architect, and he certainly does not know you are talking to the FBI. I will compile a complete, irrefutable digital dossier of every single stolen dime, tracing the exact path from Gallagher Financial to Chelsea's storefront. Once I have the final data packet, I will transfer it directly to your federal contact. Andre extended his hand, his expression mirroring my own relentless determination. Carter and Chelsea destroyed our lives because they thought we were weak, invisible collateral damage in their pursuit of wealth. They are about to find out exactly how dangerous the invisible people can be. I took his hand, sealing our tactical alliance with a firm, decisive grip. We parted ways in the shadows of the abandoned garage, our paths diverging, but our ultimate goal perfectly aligned. Armed with the damning ledgers, I drove back to my motel room to finish building the digital coffin Carter had so arrogantly designed for himself. The execution was entering its final fatal phase. I spent the next 72 hours entirely sequestered inside the dim motel room, meticulously cross-referencing the physical ledgers Andre had provided with the encrypted digital evidence I had harvested from the Gallagher mainframe. I compiled every single fraudulent transaction, every offshore routing protocol, and every fabricated vendor invoice into a massive, undeniable dossier of absolute guilt. While digital files could be mysteriously corrupted or fiercely disputed by high-priced corporate defense lawyers, physical ink and paper audit documents carrying the official seal of the chief risk officer possessed a specific terrifying weight. Winston Gallagher required these hard copies for the emergency closed-door executive board meeting scheduled for that very afternoon. It was officially time to leave the shadows. I discarded the oversized, rumpled clothes I had worn since the night of my expulsion. Utilizing the limitless corporate expense account Winston had quietly activated for me, I procured a razor-sharp charcoal gray designer suit. It was tailored to absolute perfection, featuring clean, aggressive lines that projected an aura of unyielding authority. I pulled my hair back into a severe, polished style and applied minimal striking makeup. Looking into the mirror, the frightened, invisible wife was entirely gone, replaced by the clinical, predatory precision of the architect. The Gallagher Financial headquarters was a towering monolith of steel and reflective glass that dominated the downtown commercial skyline. I strode through the spinning revolving doors and across the sprawling marble lobby, my heels clicking against the stone with a steady rhythmic cadence. The atmosphere was buzzing with the usual high-stakes corporate energy, the hundreds of employees completely oblivious to the impending massacre about to unfold on the top floors. I bypassed the standard security lines and visitor check-ins entirely. My new highest-tier access badge granted me seamless, unquestioned entry through the private biometric turnstiles reserved strictly for senior executive leadership. I pressed the call button for the top floor and stepped into the expansive mahogany-paneled executive elevator. I was alone for only a brief moment. The heavy doors were just beginning to glide shut when a hand shot out, interrupting the motion sensors. The doors slid open again, and the air inside the confined, polished space immediately shifted. Carter and Sienna stepped in. They were both staring intently at their respective smartphones, a frantic, barely concealed tension radiating from their stiff postures. They were clearly still locked out of their massive slush funds, the unseen digital blockade I had initiated slowly driving them insane with paranoia. Carter reached out to press his floor button and completely froze. His arrogant, confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second as he registered the sharp, tailored designer suit and the cold, unrecognizable fire burning in my eyes. Sienna noticed his sudden hesitation and glanced up from her screen, her manicured hand flying to her mouth in a display of genuine, unscripted shock. The surprise evaporated almost instantly, quickly replaced by a vicious, defensive cruelty. Carter let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as the elevator began its smooth, rapid ascent. "Look who decided to finally crawl out of the gutter," Carter sneered, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. "I honestly did not think you had the stomach to ever show your face in this part of town again, Gwen. Tell me you are not here to grovel to human resources for some pathetic, low-level clerical job. Because if you are, I can assure you that my influence extends far past the portfolio management division. I will have your desperate application shredded before it even hits a hiring manager's desk." I remained perfectly still, my posture rigidly straight, my eyes locked dead ahead at the glowing brass floor indicator above the doors. I held the thick leather portfolio containing their absolute destruction loosely at my side. I did not offer a single word of defense, justification, or anger. I simply let him speak. Sienna leaned into Carter, a cruel, mocking smile playing on her glossy lips. "It is genuinely pathetic, Carter," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "She comes in here, wearing what looks like a cheap knockoff suit, desperately trying to play the part of a corporate professional. You would think she would have learned her lesson by now." Sienna turned her gaze directly to me, her eyes glittering with blatant malice. "You really should have stayed hidden away in whatever hole you crawled into, Gwen. Carter is taking me to the Diamond District this afternoon. We are picking out the engagement ring he is going to buy me, now that his dead weight has finally been permanently cut loose. It is going to be a custom cut, something entirely out of your comprehension and completely out of your former tax bracket." Carter puffed out his chest, wrapping his arm possessively around Sienna's waist. He was wildly overcompensating, using his classic bullying tactics to mask the sheer suffocating panic currently gnawing at him from the inside. He desperately needed to feel powerful and in control while his illicit digital empire was inexplicably burning down to ash around him. "You are looking at the future. Vice president of this entire firm," Gwen Carter boasted, his voice loud and highly aggressive, filling the small elevator. "I am completely untouchable in this building. I generate more revenue for Winston Gallagher than any other director on the trading floor. I hold the keys to this kingdom. You are nothing but a discarded mistake, a homeless college dropout who foolishly thought she could latch onto my success and ride my coattails forever." I let the heavy silence stretch, absorbing every single arrogant, damning word. They were willingly digging their own graves with remarkable speed, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were standing shoulder to shoulder with their executioner. Carter's claims of being untouchable were almost beautifully ironic. He had absolutely no idea that his precious administrative bypass codes were permanently disabled, that his offshore accounts were entirely frozen in federal purgatory, and that the silent woman he was relentlessly mocking held the physical evidence of his federal crimes tightly in her hands. He was bragging about holding the keys to a kingdom that I now owned. The elevator chimed softly, signaling our arrival at the 42nd floor, the bustling staging ground for the portfolio management division. The heavy mahogany doors slid open. Carter stepped out first, pulling a smug Sienna along with him. He turned back to look at me, a look of utter dismissive disgust plastered across his handsome features. "Do yourself a massive favor and leave this building right now before I have security throw you out onto the pavement," Carter commanded, pointing a finger at me. "You do not belong here, Gwen. You never did." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I simply offered him a slow, chillingly calm smile, letting the heavy doors glide shut between us without uttering a single syllable. The elevator continued its rapid ascent to the penthouse level, where Winston Gallagher and the entire executive board were currently waiting in a secured conference room for the chief risk officer to arrive. The time for silence and observation was officially over. The elevator doors chimed and parted, revealing the hushed, hyper-modern expanse of the penthouse executive suite. I bypassed the receptionist, striding directly into the glass-walled boardroom, where Winston Gallagher and 5 highly intimidated board members sat waiting. I did not bother with pleasantries or formal introductions. I simply dropped the heavy leather portfolio onto the center of the polished mahogany table and presented the physical ledgers Andre had secured alongside the damning digital dossiers I had compiled. The air in the room grew instantly thick as the billionaire and his inner circle reviewed the undeniable proof of a massive ongoing embezzlement ring operating under their very noses. Winston did not speak a word. He simply nodded, his jaw clenched in absolute fury, and slid a sleek platinum keycard across the table. It granted me immediate access to the corner office directly across the hall from his own. I settled into my new domain, a pristine sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline. More importantly, it offered an unobstructed digital window into the decaying heart of Carter's operations. I booted up my monitors, bringing my proprietary tracking algorithms back online. The trap I had set earlier that morning was still holding firm, but the pressure inside Carter's department had reached a critical mass. The quarterly board audit was officially scheduled for the following afternoon, and Carter was currently staring down a multi-million-dollar void in his primary offshore accounts. The panic I had witnessed in the elevator was rapidly metamorphosing into blind, self-destructive desperation. I watched the real-time server logs with predatory fascination. Carter and Sienna had retreated into his private office, locking the door and drawing the blinds, entirely unaware that physical privacy meant absolutely nothing when their network connection was actively being monitored by the system's supreme administrator. The digital telemetry on my screens painted a vivid, chaotic picture of their next move. Carter was attempting to brute force a massive, highly illegal wire transfer to cover the missing funds before the auditors arrived. It was a staggering sum, an amount requiring multi-tiered executive approval that he absolutely did not possess. He was trying to pull capital from a dormant international holding account and dump it into the flagged ledger to make the balance sheet appear whole. His terminal flashed with a series of frantic rapid-fire keystrokes. I monitored his exact inputs as he circumvented the standard liquidity protocols by leveraging a future asset. He was utilizing his impending but entirely unconfirmed promotion to senior vice president as collateral to authorize an emergency corporate credit line. It was a move of breathtaking arrogance and sheer stupidity, a flagrant violation of federal banking laws. He was attempting to borrow millions from the firm itself to cover the millions he had already stolen from the firm, assuming his golden boy reputation would shield the transaction from scrutiny. But he could not push the maneuver through the final security gate alone. The system demanded authentic countersignatures from the executive suite to release that level of capital. A secondary data stream lit up on my right monitor, glowing with a steady, incriminating pulse. Sienna had logged into her terminal using a secured proxy, attempting to mask her location, but my tracking code effortlessly stripped away the false IP address, pinpointing her exact physical coordinates right next to Carter. She was bypassing the internal verification system, deploying a sophisticated skimming software to digitally copy and paste the encrypted signatures of two senior board members onto Carter's wire transfer request. She was knowingly aiding and abetting massive corporate fraud, tethering her own fate to his sinking ship with absolute undeniable precision. Every click of her mouse, every file she accessed to lift the digital signatures registered on my screen as a glaring red alert. I sat perfectly still in the quiet hum of my glass office, watching the progress bar of their fraudulent transaction inch forward. 50%, 70%, 90%. They were pushing the transfer through the network, holding their breath, believing they had successfully outsmarted the invisible force hunting them. They thought they had just saved themselves from total ruin, wrapping a fresh layer of deceit over their crumbling empire. I did not block the transfer. If I stopped it, they could claim it was a simple system error, or a misrouted request, giving them room to build a plausible defense or feign ignorance. Instead, I let the transaction execute fully, allowing the digital ink to dry on their felony. As the system registered the completion of the massive wire transfer, my fingers flew across the keyboard. I triggered a silent, high-level data capture protocol. I seized the entire fraudulent transaction in real time, digitally photographing every single keystroke, logging their localized IP addresses, and permanently preserving the forged executive signatures before they could even attempt to scrub the local terminal history. I secured the exact timestamps showing Sienna manipulating the board members' credentials and Carter authorizing the release of funds he did not own. I packed the raw data into an encrypted read-only file, sealing the forensic evidence in an immutable digital vault. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely crushed them, and they had willingly handed me the weapon. With the forensic data securely locked away, the remainder of the work week bled into the weekend with a quiet, lethal inevitability. The corporate board meeting, the ultimate reckoning where Winston Gallagher would drop the guillotine, was scheduled for Monday morning. Carter and Sienna believed they had successfully plugged the gaping hole in their offshore accounts, blissfully unaware that their frantic 11th-hour wire transfer was the exact maneuver that permanently sealed their destruction. They felt invincible, riding the high of an averted crisis. To celebrate their perceived victory and his impending yet entirely fictional promotion to Senior Vice President, Carter decided to host an extravagant family dinner at his sprawling suburban estate that Saturday evening. I did not need an invitation to attend. I had a front-row seat to the entire spectacle from the quiet solace of my own living room, illuminated only by the glow of my laptop screen and the burner phone resting on the coffee table. Chelsea, ever the narcissistic socialite, could not resist turning a private celebration into a public broadcast. She initiated a high-definition live stream on her primary social media account, eager to flaunt her brother's manufactured wealth to her thousands of sycophantic followers. I pulled up the video feed, watching the grotesque display of excess unfold in real time. Carter's mansion was a monument to stolen capital. The massive dining room was bathed in the warm golden light of crystal chandeliers, the long mahogany table groaning under the weight of an absurdly lavish catered feast. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms, paid for entirely by Gallagher Financial's diverted corporate funds, moved seamlessly through the background, pouring endless flutes of vintage champagne that cost more than a junior analyst's monthly salary. Carter sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with arrogance and expensive alcohol. He wore a custom velvet smoking jacket, looking every bit the triumphant conqueror holding court over his loyal subjects. He laughed too loudly, gesturing expansively with a crystal tumbler as he regaled the table with fabricated stories of his corporate conquests. It was a masterclass in delusion. He was celebrating a promotion that had already been quietly revoked, funded by money he no longer controlled, inside a house he was destined to lose. Chelsea dominated the camera's perspective, her face perfectly contoured and plastered with a brilliant artificial smile. She held her smartphone high, panning across the opulent spread and the laughing faces of their extended family and eager hangers-on. She narrated the event with breathless excitement, making sure every viewer understood the sheer magnitude of their social and financial superiority. Then, with a practiced dramatic sweep, she turned the lens directly toward the seat of honor next to Carter. Sienna sat there, basking in the glow of the camera light. She looked radiant, exuding the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally secured the ultimate prize. But it was not her designer silk gown or her perfectly styled hair that caught the glaring light of the chandelier. It was the heavy jewelry resting against her collarbone. She was wearing a massive multi-carat diamond necklace. It was a breathtaking custom-cut piece of undeniable extravagance. Looking at the spectacular arrangement of precious stones shining through my monitor, I immediately recognized the physical manifestation of the illegal wire transfer I had watched them forge just 48 hours prior. They had not merely covered their tracks, they had brazenly skimmed off the top of their own emergency loan to purchase a glittering trophy. Chelsea leaned into the frame, pressing her cheek against Sienna's with exaggerated cloying affection. "Look at this gorgeous woman right here," Chelsea cooed to her digital audience, her voice shrill and echoing over the live stream's audio feed. She pointed a manicured finger at the blinding diamonds around Sienna's neck. Carter really outdid himself this time, did he not? Only the absolute best for the future vice president's bride. I am so incredibly happy tonight. Finally, I have the sister I actually wanted. The cruelty was deliberate, a sharp, highly public barb aimed directly at the ghost of the woman they had thrown out into the cold. Chelsea beamed at the camera, waiting for the digital validation of hearts and comments to flood her screen. Sienna offered a demure, glittering smile, touching the diamonds with a delicate, practiced finger. They were reveling in their victory, using my absence as a punchline to elevate their own celebration. I watched the screen without a single trace of anger or hurt. The emotional vulnerability they were trying to exploit had been surgically excised days ago. Let them wear the stolen diamonds. Let them broadcast their federal crimes to the entire world. It only made the impending drop that much steeper. As Chelsea continued to parade her brother's wealth for the internet, the burner phone on my coffee table vibrated, glowing brightly in the dim room. I unlocked the screen to find a steady stream of encrypted text messages flowing in from Andre. He was sitting right there at that very table, positioned perfectly within the frame of Chelsea's live stream. I could see him in the background of the video feed, wearing a tailored suit and a polite, restrained smile. He looked exactly like the picture-perfect supportive husband, dutifully playing his assigned role in the family pageant. But his hands were hidden beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, rapidly typing out real-time intelligence. The catered menu alone cost 5 figures, Andre's first text read. Carter just tipped the sommelier with a thick stack of $100 bills. The sheer arrogance is suffocating. It is taking every ounce of my willpower not to reach across and overturn this table. I watched the live stream as Carter stood up, tapping his knife against his crystal glass. The chatter in the expansive dining room quickly died down as the guests turned their undivided attention to the head of the table. Carter puffed out his chest, preparing to deliver a grand toast to his own greatness. My phone vibrated again. "They are toasting to his new promotion," Andre texted. "Carter is giving a ridiculous speech about the value of absolute loyalty and ruthless ambition." Chelsea is practically weeping with pride over her phone. It is a complete circus of delusion. I looked from the text message back to the live video feed. Carter was speaking passionately, his arm wrapped tightly around Sienna's waist, as he thanked everyone for standing by him on his meteoric rise to the absolute pinnacle of Gallagher Financial. He promised them all that this was only the very beginning, that the wealth and untouchable luxury they were experiencing tonight would be their new permanent reality. The guests enthusiastically raised their glasses in unison, their voices joining together in a loud chorus of congratulations. The burner phone buzzed one final time, delivering a message that perfectly encapsulated the terrifying irony of the entire evening. "They are drinking $1,000 champagne bought with stolen corporate funds," Andre wrote his text, carrying the cold, clinical weight of a ticking time bomb. "They are laughing and celebrating, completely blind to the reality of their situation. They have absolutely no idea what is coming." I locked the phone and closed the laptop, plunging my living room back into total darkness. The dinner of lies was drawing to a spectacular close, and the weekend was rapidly ticking away. Monday morning was fast approaching, bringing with it a corporate storm that would violently strip away their stolen diamonds, their mansions, and their freedom. I leaned back in the quiet dark, waiting for the dawn. The dawn broke over the city in a wash of cold slate gray, casting long, sharp shadows across my living room. I had not slept a single moment since shutting my laptop the night before. Instead, I had spent the quiet, solitary hours meticulously binding the final audit report. This was no longer just a collection of digital traces and circumstantial anomalies. It was a comprehensive, airtight prosecution narrative. I laid out the physical ledgers Andre had smuggled from Chelsea's boutique, cross-referencing them page by page with the digital routing numbers I had extracted from Carter's shadow servers. I printed out the high-resolution captures of the illegal wire transfer Carter had attempted on Friday afternoon, highlighting the exact timestamp where Sienna had digitally grafted the forged executive signatures onto the authorization forms. Every stolen dollar was tracked, traced, and accounted for. The narrative was inescapable. By noon on Sunday, the Gallagher Financial building was a silent, cavernous tomb. The usual frantic energy of the trading floors was completely absent, replaced by the humming of the climate control systems and the occasional squeak of a security guard's rubber-soled shoes. I swiped my platinum keycard at the private elevator bank, descending into the sub-basement levels, where Winston Gallagher maintained a secure, soundproofed boardroom. It was a sterile, windowless environment designed specifically for crisis management and high-level corporate triage. Winston was already seated at the head of the long, polished obsidian table when I entered. He looked tired but sharply focused, dressed in a casual cashmere sweater that contrasted starkly with his usual rigid three-piece armor. He gestured for me to sit opposite him. I placed the massive leather-bound dossier onto the dark surface and slid it firmly across the table. I did not offer any preamble or dramatic introduction. I simply opened the file and began walking him through the anatomy of his firm's betrayal. I started with the initial offshore siphoning, showing exactly how Carter had bypassed the portfolio risk limits by creating ghost subsidiaries. I watched Winston's jaw clench as his eyes scanned the printed server logs, his expression darkening with each page turn. I then laid out the physical ledgers from the luxury boutique. I explained the laundering cycle in precise clinical detail, demonstrating how Chelsea had washed the stolen Gallagher capital through fabricated inventory purchases and clean retail deposits. When I presented the final piece of evidence, the emergency wire transfer from Friday afternoon, the temperature in the secure boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. I pointed directly to the digital captures of Sienna's terminal. I showed Winston the exact keystrokes where his own digital signature, along with the signature of the chief financial officer, had been illegally duplicated and pasted onto the authorization forms to release the final millions. Winston sat in absolute silence for several long minutes. He traced a finger over the forged signatures, his breathing slow and measured. The fury radiating from him was not loud or explosive. It was a cold, terrifying absolute zero. He had personally mentored Carter. He had elevated him, trusted him with the firm's most sensitive portfolios, and positioned him as the golden boy of Gallagher Financial. The betrayal was not just financial, it was profoundly personal. They utilized my own name to rob my company. Winston stated, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that echoed off the soundproofed walls. They sat in my office, drank my scotch, and smiled in my face, while treating this institution like their personal piggy bank. He closed the heavy leather folder, resting both hands flat against its surface. The billionaire looked up, his piercing gaze locking directly onto mine. The anger in his eyes momentarily receded, replaced by a profound, undeniable respect. "You operated entirely in the shadows," Gwen Winston said, his tone shifting into one of quiet awe. "You bypassed our entire cybersecurity infrastructure, tracked down a highly sophisticated laundering ring, coordinated with a federal whistleblower, and handed me the exact rope Carter used to hang himself. My own risk management team missed this for years. You dismantled it in a matter of days. Your execution has been completely flawless." I held his gaze, refusing to show a single flicker of intimidation. "I told you I would build his coffin, Mr. Gallagher. All you have to do now is nail it shut." Winston offered a slow, predatory smile. He stood up from the obsidian table, picking up the dossier. "I am calling an emergency mandatory meeting of the Senior Executive Board for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Winston announced, his voice snapping back into the commanding cadence of a titan. "Carter will be required to attend, believing he is finally receiving his official promotion to Senior Vice President. Sienna will be there to take the minutes. I want you in that room, Gwen. I want you standing at the head of the table. Tomorrow morning the floor is entirely yours. You will present this evidence. You will drive the final nail." I nodded once, accepting the mandate. I left the secure boardroom and took the elevator back up to my glass office on the top floor. The city below was beginning to transition into evening, the streetlights flickering on across the sprawling grid. I sat at my desk and opened my presentation software. For years I had been the invisible, supportive wife, standing quietly in the background while Carter belittled my intelligence and Chelsea mocked my background. They had viewed me as collateral damage, a weak and disposable stepping stone in their arrogant pursuit of unearned wealth. As I formatted the slides, placing the forged signatures and the incriminating offshore balances into stark, unforgiving graphics, I created a visual map that traced the money from Gallagher Financial across the ocean to the ghost accounts and directly into the cash registers of Chelsea's downtown boutique. I wanted the board to see the sheer arrogance of the operation in full, undeniable color. A profound sense of calm washed over me. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, leaving behind the pure, crystalline focus of absolute vindication. I was no longer fighting to save a toxic marriage or begging for basic respect. I was preparing to surgically dismantle a criminal ring and reclaim my own life from the people who had tried to destroy it. I finalized the digital presentation and backed it up to a secure, encrypted flash drive, slipping the small metal device into my pocket like a loaded weapon. I turned off the monitors, casting my office into shadows, save for the ambient light bleeding in from the city below. The trap was perfectly primed. The evidence was irrefutable. I looked out over the darkening skyline, feeling the weight of the past decade finally lifting from my shoulders. The long, agonizing silence was over. The storm was gathered, waiting just over the horizon. Monday morning was coming, and I was fully prepared to burn their kingdom to the ground. The crisp Monday morning broke with a blinding, sterile brilliance, sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Gallagher Financial Executive Boardroom. The space was designed to intimidate a cavernous theater of corporate warfare, suspended 50 stories above the bustling city streets. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs occupied by the 12 most powerful members of the board of directors. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, freshly brewed espresso, and the sharp, undeniable tension that always preceded the quarterly financial audit. At the far end of the room, Sienna sat perched on a minimalist stool, her posture rigidly perfect as she prepared to take the official minutes. She wore a tailored ivory dress that screamed of newfound illicit wealth, her eyes darting across the room with a predatory gleam. She was the picture of a loyal executive assistant, but beneath the veneer she was reveling in the adrenaline of their massive hidden heist. Winston Gallagher sat at the absolute head of the table. His expression was carved from granite. He gave nothing away. His hands folded neatly over a blank leather folio. To the uninitiated, he appeared to be a stern patriarch preparing to review standard profit margins. Only I knew that beneath his stoic exterior, a lethal, calculated fury was waiting to be unleashed. Winston nodded sharply to his left, signaling the start of the proceedings. Carter sprang from his seat with the eager, coiled energy of a predator preparing to feast. He smoothed the lapels of his immaculate, custom-tailored navy suit and strode confidently to the front of the room. He oozed an almost suffocating arrogance, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile that had charmed countless investors and manipulated entirely too many victims. He connected his sleek tablet to the central projection system, bringing the massive digital display behind him to life. "Gentlemen," Carter began, his voice projecting a rich, hypnotic baritone that demanded total attention. "I am thrilled to report that this past quarter has not just exceeded our internal projections. It has entirely shattered them." The screen behind him flashed with a series of dazzling high-resolution graphics. Brilliant green arrows charted an impossibly steep upward trajectory. Bar graphs and pie charts danced across the display, showcasing massive returns, diversified international holdings, and an influx of new high-net-worth client capital. It was a masterclass in visual deception, a flashy, entirely fabricated presentation designed to mask a hollow, bleeding core. As you can see from our localized reporting, my portfolio management division has driven record-breaking growth across all primary sectors. Carter continued, pacing smoothly across the front of the room. By implementing aggressive, highly strategic liquidity maneuvers in our offshore accounts, we have capitalized on emerging international markets while maintaining zero exposure to domestic volatility. We have essentially engineered a flawless, perpetual revenue machine. He threw around complex financial jargon with effortless grace, dazzling the older, more traditional board members who nodded along in appreciative silence. He was selling them a ghost ship, pointing to the shiny paint on the hull, while actively drilling holes in the bottom. He highlighted the massive phantom returns generated by his shadow subsidiaries, explicitly taking credit for the exact offshore entities he was using to funnel money to Chelsea's boutique. Carter paused, letting the fabricated numbers sink in. He caught Sienna's eye across the room. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the consummate professional slipped, and they shared a brief, intensely smug smirk. They were completely convinced they had pulled it off. The gap in the ledgers was covered by their fraudulent Friday wire transfer. The money was safely cycling through the retail wash, and the board was visibly eating out of the palm of his hand. Carter concluded his presentation by spreading his arms wide, a gesture of absolute unearned triumph. He was not just delivering a quarterly report, he was delivering his own coronation speech. He fully expected Winston to stand up before the hour was over and formally name him senior vice president. He stepped back from the digital display, his chest puffed out, basking in the polite golf clap applause from the directors around the table. "Thank you, Carter," Winston said. His voice was dangerously quiet, lacking any trace of the usual congratulatory warmth he offered his top earners. The room immediately fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The polite applause died instantly. The sudden shift in atmospheric pressure was palpable. Carter's arrogant smile faltered slightly, a microscopic twitch of uncertainty crossing his handsome features as he took a step back to yield the floor. Winston rose slowly from his heavy leather chair. He did not look at the dazzling charts on the screen. He kept his piercing, cold gaze locked entirely on Carter. The billionaire walked to the mahogany podium, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand, looking out over the assembled executives. "Those are truly remarkable numbers," Carter Winston stated, his tone deceptively mild, like a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "A fascinating display of creative financial engineering. Record-breaking growth is exactly what we strive for in this building. However, before we move to finalize any structural changes to our executive hierarchy or discuss any impending promotions, there is a vital piece of internal business we must address immediately." Winston turned his gaze away from Carter, sweeping his eyes across the 12 board members. For the past several years, Gallagher Financial has operated with a severe, catastrophic blind spot in our internal risk management protocols. Winston announced, his voice rising in volume and authority, echoing off the glass walls. "We have relied on automated systems and blind trust to safeguard our clients' capital. That era of blind trust ends this morning. I have realized that to protect the integrity of this institution, we require a perspective that operates entirely outside our established corporate bubble. We require someone who can see the invisible threats." Carter shifted his weight nervously, shooting a quick, panicked glance toward Sienna. Sienna had stopped typing, her stylus hovering uselessly over her tablet, her pristine posture suddenly rigid with apprehension. The smug confidence from moments earlier was evaporating, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. Therefore, Winston continued, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding finality. "Before we review another single chart or approve another offshore maneuver, I must formally introduce the company's new Chief Risk Officer to this board. She has spent the last week conducting a comprehensive, independent, and highly classified audit of our most successful divisions." Winston turned his head toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom. Carter followed his gaze, his breathing suddenly shallow, entirely oblivious to the fact that his absolute doom was waiting just on the other side of that threshold. The heavy mahogany double doors at the rear of the executive boardroom swung inward with a smooth, perfectly calibrated glide. The muted click of the brass latch disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the expectant, hushed environment of the room. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the anonymity of the outer corridor behind, and walking directly into the blinding sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not wear the subdued domestic attire my husband was accustomed to seeing me in, the soft fabrics and neutral tones I used to blend into the background of his life. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal power suit, my heels clicking with a measured, rhythmic precision against the polished hardwood floor. I held my head high, exuding a cold, absolute authority that instantly commanded the attention of every billionaire director and senior shareholder seated at the massive table. At the front of the room, Carter physically malfunctioned. His brain simply could not process the visual information being relayed to it. The sleek metal laser pointer, the instrument he had just used to confidently highlight his fabricated financial triumphs, slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp echoing clatter that rolled under the grand table, a harsh metallic sound that pierced the quiet room. He did not even attempt to retrieve it. The flush of arrogant triumph that had painted his face mere seconds ago was instantaneously erased, the color completely draining from his cheeks and leaving him a sickly, chalky white. His meticulously practiced posture, the confident stance of a conqueror, completely collapsed. He stumbled backward, his polished dress shoes catching clumsily on the edge of the podium mat. His hands grasped blindly at the wooden stand to keep himself upright, his knuckles turning white as he clung to it for physical support. His jaw went slack, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the woman he believed he had successfully subjugated for a decade now, walking into the very heart of his sanctuary, like an executioner arriving for a scheduled beheading. From her position at the periphery of the room, a sharp, audible gasp ripped through the silence. Sienna's hand flew to her mouth, her manicured nails digging into her perfectly glossed lips to stifle the sound of her own terror. Her stylus dropped onto her digital tablet with a hollow tap. Her eyes darted wildly from Carter's pale, terrified face to my advancing figure, then to the imposing form of Winston Gallagher. The horrifying realization crashed down upon her with the weight of a collapsing building. She had spent the last week desperately trying to outmaneuver an invisible phantom hunting her through the network, constantly looking over her digital shoulder, never once suspecting that the phantom was sitting across the dinner table from her illicit lover. The terror radiating from her rigid form was palpable. The expensive ivory dress she wore, purchased with diverted funds, suddenly looked less like a victory gown and more like a high-end prison uniform. I ignored them both. I walked the length of the massive mahogany table, my gaze locked entirely on the chairman. The 12 senior board members swiveled in their plush leather chairs, their expressions morphing from mild confusion to intense calculating curiosity. They were apex predators in the financial world, and they instantly recognized the dramatic shift in the room's hierarchy. They watched my progression with silent fascination. I reached the head of the table and took my place directly beside Winston Gallagher, standing perfectly still, a silent, unyielding sentinel ready to deliver the final verdict. Winston remained standing, his hands planted firmly on the dark wood. He deliberately allowed the tension to stretch, letting Carter's highly visible panic marinate before the assembled board. He wanted every director to witness the Golden Boy's absolute disintegration. Directors. Winston began, his voice cutting through the thick, electrified air with surgical precision. Allow me to formally introduce you to the individual who just saved this institution from catastrophic, unrecoverable ruin. Many of you know the unparalleled security framework that protects our global assets. You know the proprietary algorithms that shield our liquidity from external breaches. What you do not know is the identity of the architect who built that fortress. Winston gestured smoothly in my direction, his eyes never leaving the terrified man at the front of the room. This is the creator of our entire digital infrastructure, Winston announced, each word dropping like an anvil onto Carter's chest. She is the legendary Phantom developer who has operated on retainer for this firm since its major restructuring. She knows our networks better than the engineers who maintain them because she wrote the foundational code that governs every single byte of data flowing through this building. Carter's mouth opened, a pathetic, strangled sound dying in his throat before it could form into a word. The cognitive dissonance of hearing his wife, the woman he constantly manipulated regarding her technological competence, introduced as the ultimate architect of his company's security, was entirely breaking his mind. Furthermore, the chairman continued, his piercing gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. I am officially announcing her immediate elevation to our executive team. She is our newly appointed Chief Risk Officer, and her first mandate, enacted directly under my highest personal authorization, has been a month-long forensic audit of the very portfolio you just applauded. Winston turned his body slightly, aiming his words like a sniper rifle directly at the front of the room. She has spent the last 30 days silently dismantling the digital illusions presented to you this morning. She has traced every fabricated return, mapped every shadow subsidiary, and cataloged every single violation of our corporate trust. She did not just audit the division's generic spreadsheets. She forensically dissected the specific localized operations managed by the man standing before you. The room went dead silent. It was a complete suffocating vacuum of sound. The low hum of the climate control system seemed to vanish. The ambient noise of the city 50 stories below was entirely muted. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with the undeniable realization that a corporate bloodbath was about to take place. 12 of the most powerful executives in the financial sector stared at Carter, their earlier admiration instantly converting into cold, predatory scrutiny. They realized they had just been lied to, presented with a fabricated narrative of record-breaking growth, and the woman standing beside the chairman possessed the unvarnished, devastating truth. The Golden Boy routine was dead. The charismatic facade had been violently ripped away, leaving only a terrified, cornered thief staring down the barrel of his own destruction, trapped in a silence so absolute it felt like the end of the world. The silence shattered not with a dignified defense, but with the shrill, frantic bleating of a cornered animal. Carter's survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding his initial paralysis, but they manifested as sheer, unfiltered panic. He lunged forward from the podium, his perfectly manicured hands slamming down onto the polished mahogany surface. He pointed a trembling, manic finger in my direction, his handsome features twisting into an ugly, desperate mask of rage. He raised his voice, shouting over the ambient hum of the room, begging the 12 stunned executives to recognize this as a massive, orchestrated misunderstanding. He vehemently claimed it was a sick, vindictive joke perpetrated by a bitter woman. He yelled, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls, that I was his unstable, jealous ex-wife. He painted a frantic picture of a disgruntled spouse trying to sabotage his immaculate career out of sheer, unadulterated spite. He turned to Winston, his eyes wide and pleading, demanding that security be called to escort me from the premises immediately. He insisted that I had no security clearance, no corporate authority, and absolutely no grasp on reality. His voice cracked a pathetic, high-pitched contrast to the commanding, hypnotic baritone he had employed just moments before. He was frantically trying to spin a narrative of domestic drama to shield his corporate treason, throwing his own marriage under the bus to save his professional skin. Sienna, relegated to the back of the room, had physically shrunk against the paneled wall. She looked as though she wanted the expensive ivory fabric of her dress to swallow her whole. Her eyes darted wildly, seeking an escape route that did not exist. The board members, however, did not move a single muscle. They did not reach for their phones, nor did they call for security guards. They were apex predators of the financial world, and they simply watched in cold fascination as a man who had just promised them endless wealth devolved into a raving, red-faced lunatic. Winston remained perfectly still beside me, a silent titan, allowing Carter to exhaust his frantic, flailing defense. He let the pathetic display run its course, ensuring every single director witnessed the sheer, undeniable desperation of a guilty man. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I did not dignify his insults with a defensive response or matching anger. My pulse was steady, my breathing calm. I walked smoothly around the massive mahogany table, closing the distance between us with measured, predatory steps. Carter physically flinched as I approached the podium, his chest heaving, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. I reached out and calmly plucked the digital presentation remote directly from his sweaty, trembling palm. He offered no resistance, his grip completely failing him under the weight of his own terror. I turned my back to him, facing the glowing projection screen, and plugged my encrypted flash drive into the primary console port. With a single decisive press of a button, I overrode his fabricated slideshow. The brilliant green arrows, the dazzling pie charts, and the fictional growth projections vanished, instantly wiped from existence, and replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of his massive theft. The massive screen illuminated with a complex, highly detailed web of offshore routing numbers. I tapped the remote, highlighting the exact trajectory of Gallagher Financial's missing capital. I did not speak. I let the data do the talking. The board watched in stunned silence as the graphics demonstrated how millions of dollars were systematically diverted from high-yield, legitimate domestic accounts into untraceable ghost subsidiaries scattered across the Cayman Islands. Next to the routing logs, I projected the corresponding bank statements, matching the exact outflow of corporate funds to the inflow of Carter's hidden personal reserves down to the very last cent. Then I clicked to the next slide. High-resolution receipts and transaction logs materialized on the massive display. I showcased the itemized luxury purchases made over the past 18 months, all funded directly by the diverted corporate capital. I highlighted a recent exceptionally large acquisition, a multi-carat custom-cut diamond necklace. I did not need to point out the wearer. The glare of the morning sun pouring through the windows caught the exact same arrangement of precious stones, resting against Sienna's collarbone, at the back of the room, broadcasting her complicity to everyone present. Several directors physically turned their heads in their leather chairs to stare directly at the executive assistant. She let out a small whimper and buried her face in her trembling hands, her glittering prize now acting as a radiant beacon of her own guilt. I clicked the remote again, shifting the focus to the money laundering mechanism. The screen filled with high-definition forensic scans of the physical ledgers I had secured from Chelsea's boutique. I displayed the retail wash cycle side by side with the offshore transfers, proving unequivocally how Carter had utilized his sister's failing fashion business to legitimize his stolen millions through a constant stream of fabricated inventory invoices and phantom retail sales. Finally, I brought up the absolute masterpiece of his own destruction. The screen went dark for a fraction of a second before brightly illuminating with the emergency corporate credit line authorization forms. I magnified the timestamp showing the board that these highly illegal documents had been generated and processed a mere 48 hours ago. I circled the requested amount in glaring red, a staggering multi-million-dollar wire transfer designed to plug the gaping hole in his raided accounts just before this very audit commenced. Then I zoomed in on the bottom of the document. The digital signatures of Winston Gallagher and the chief financial officer were displayed in crisp, undeniable detail. I placed the forensic keystroke logs right next to the authorization forms displaying Sienna's localized IP address. The data painted a flawless picture showing her lifting those exact executive signatures from the secure corporate archive and directly pasting them onto the fraudulent loan request, permanently sealing their fate in irrefutable digital ink. The digital ink of the forged signatures glowed with a harsh, damning light against the projector screen. For a span of 10 agonizing seconds, the silence held heavy and suffocating. Then the reality of the situation finally breached the shock-induced paralysis gripping the back of the room. The absolute certainty of federal prison with its iron bars and decades-long sentences crashed into Sienna. The pristine, polished veneer of the loyal executive assistant shattered completely. She sprang up from her position against the paneled wall. The sudden violent movement sent her minimalist stool crashing to the floor, the sharp crack of wood on hardwood echoing like a starting pistol. "He made me do it!" Sienna shrieked, her voice tearing through the boardroom with a raw, panicked hysteria. She thrust a trembling finger toward the front of the room, aiming it directly at the man she had been conspiring with for years. It was all him. Every single transfer, every forged document, Carter orchestrated the entire thing. The directors turned their collective gaze toward her, their expressions a mix of profound disgust and cold curiosity. Sienna did not care. She was fighting for her freedom, abandoning every ounce of loyalty to save herself. She took a step forward, her chest heaving, tears of genuine terror streaming down her face and ruining her immaculate makeup. "I am just an assistant," she sobbed, playing the victim with desperate, frantic energy. "He is the senior vice president of the division. He threatened to fire me. He told me that if I did not bypass the security protocols and mirror the chairman's signature, he would completely ruin my career. He said he would blacklist me from the entire financial sector. I had no choice. I was terrified of him. I was coerced into executing those transfers. She was weaving a frantic narrative of workplace intimidation and helpless compliance, hoping the older patriarchal members of the board would view her as a naive subordinate, manipulated by a predatory superior. She wept openly now, clutching her arms around her chest, desperately trying to distance herself from the multi-million-dollar theft currently projected in high definition behind Carter's head. Carter, already pushed to the absolute brink of his sanity, snapped. The sight of his illicit partner, the woman who had eagerly helped him drain the company coffers, suddenly casting him as a solo mastermind, triggered a vicious, rabid retaliation. The remaining blood in his body seemed to rush directly to his face, turning his pale complexion a mottled, furious crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his custom-tailored collar. "You lying, parasitic thief!" Carter roared, his baritone voice cracking with unhinged fury as he lunged a step toward the center of the table. He pointed back at Sienna, his hand shaking with violent rage. "Do not let her play the victim. She is a master manipulator. She orchestrated this entire disaster. She bled me dry." He turned frantically to Winston, then to the assembled board, his eyes wide and manic. He was a drowning man trying to pull someone else under to stay afloat. "Look at her," he commanded, his voice echoing off the glass. "Look at the diamonds on her neck. Look at the designer dress she is wearing. Do you think an executive assistant affords that on a base salary? She demanded those things. She constantly complained about our lifestyle. She manipulated me into diverting those funds to finance her insatiable luxury habits." Carter was practically foaming at the mouth, his polished corporate persona completely annihilated. "She found the loopholes in the system," he lied, desperately trying to rewrite the digital forensics I had just presented. "She came to me with the plan for Chelsea's boutique. She is a gold digger who used me to fund a lifestyle she could not earn herself. I am a victim of her greed. I was trying to protect my family, and she threatened to expose our affair if I did not keep the money flowing into her offshore accounts." "You coward," Sienna screamed back, her voice reaching an ear-piercing pitch. "You promised me a life together. You said we were going to run this entire company. You signed the authorization forms. You physically executed the final transfers. You pasted the digital signatures, you malicious," Carter bellowed, hurling a string of vicious profanities across the room. The executive boardroom degenerated into a chaotic, pathetic brawl. The two criminals screamed over each other, hurling vicious accusations, exposing their mutual infidelity, and airing every dirty, hidden detail of their illicit partnership in front of the 12 most powerful financial titans in the city. They were tearing each other to shreds, a spectacular display of thieves' honor, instantly dissolving the moment the lights were turned on. The board members watched in stunned, stony silence. Winston Gallagher did not flinch, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line as he let them publicly humiliate themselves. "I let the chaotic screaming match rage for exactly 60 seconds. I let them thoroughly destroy whatever shredded remnants of credibility they had left. Then I decided it was time to end the circus. I raised the presentation remote and firmly pressed a single button. A sharp, piercing burst of audio feedback blasted through the boardroom's integrated surround sound system. The sudden, high-decibel screech acted like a physical blow, instantly cutting off Carter and Sienna's frantic screaming. They both flinched, clamping their hands over their ears as the room plunged back into a ringing, heavy silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell over them to command absolute authority. I simply tapped the remote again. The massive digital screen behind Carter shifted, wiping away the financial ledgers and replacing them with a split-screen display that would seal their fate with absolute, undeniable finality. On the left side of the projection, a crisp, high-definition video began to play. It was security footage retrieved directly from the hidden internal cameras positioned inside Carter's private executive suite. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded late on a Friday evening precisely 3 weeks ago. The video showed Carter and Sienna alone in his office. They were not arguing. There was no coercion, no intimidation, and certainly no fear. They were standing by his desk, glasses of expensive scotch in their hands, sharing a deeply passionate celebratory kiss. The footage clearly captured them pulling away from each other, their faces illuminated by the glow of Carter's dual monitors. They were laughing. It was a wicked, triumphant laughter. Carter was casually swirling his drink, pointing to the screen with a smug grin, while Sienna leaned against him, her arm wrapped intimately around his waist, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. On the right side of the massive projection, directly synchronized with the video's timestamp, a rapidly scrolling column of green text appeared. It was the raw, unedited server keystroke logs and network access requests. The board watched in real time as the video showed Sienna sitting down at Carter's keyboard. Carter stood directly behind her, his hands resting possessively on her shoulders, leaning in to watch the monitor. As Sienna's fingers moved across the keyboard in the video, the corresponding keystroke logs on the right side of the screen translated her physical actions. The data unequivocally showed her bypassing the secondary firewall, accessing the restricted offshore routing portal, and eagerly initiating a massive multi-million-dollar transfer to the Cayman Island Shell Company. In the video, Carter leaned down and kissed the top of her head, the exact moment the logs confirmed the successful transfer of the stolen funds. The digital evidence was absolute. It entirely dismantled their frantic, desperate lies. It proved without a shadow of a doubt that they were not victims of each other's manipulation. There was no coercion, no intimidation, and no reluctant participation. They were equal, eager, and highly enthusiastic partners in a calculated, malicious fraud. They had colluded willingly, driven by nothing more than pure, unadulterated arrogance and insatiable greed. The screen continued to play their silent, damning celebration, illuminating the absolute ruin of the two people who thought they could outsmart the system I had built. The silent loop of the security footage played endlessly on the massive display, a glowing testament to their absolute ruin. The bright light from the projector washed over Carter and Sienna, casting harsh shadows across their terrified faces. There was no more screaming, no more frantic finger-pointing or desperate improvised lies. The undeniable truth had sucked every ounce of oxygen from the room, leaving them gasping in the vacuum of their own exposed hubris. The 12 senior executives seated around the grand mahogany table stared at the pair with a collective chilling disdain. These were men and women who calculated risk for a living, and they recognized immediately that the two individuals cowering at the front of the room were no longer colleagues or rising stars. They were toxic liabilities, infected tissue that needed to be surgically excised from the corporate body. Winston Gallagher did not break the silence immediately. He allowed the heavy, oppressive weight of the moment to bear down on Carter, forcing him to stand under the crushing glare of his own failure. Carter's broad shoulders, usually thrown back in a posture of effortless superiority, were now slumped forward. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, a loophole, any microscopic crack in the walls closing in around him. He found none. The board members simply averted their gazes or stared back with glacial hostility. Slowly, the chairman turned his head toward me. His granite expression did not soften, but there was a distinct, undeniable gleam of profound respect in his steely eyes. He gave me a single deliberate nod. It was the absolute confirmation of my authority, the final authorization to drop the hammer we had been meticulously forging in the dark. I reached into the pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket and withdrew my encrypted phone. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second, savoring the absolute power vibrating through my fingertips. I pressed a single pre-programmed button on the display. It was a silent digital flare, a signal securely routed directly to Andre, who was stationed discreetly in a black surveillance van parked in the loading dock 50 stories below. For weeks, Andre had been quietly coordinating with federal authorities, assembling a watertight dossier of digital evidence, wire transfer logs, and offshore corporate registrations. He had handed them the entire laundering operation, wrapped in a neat, undeniable bow, and they had simply been waiting for my signal to act. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy brass latch of the boardroom doors clicked again. The sound was entirely different this time, lacking the smooth, practiced discretion of an executive entrance. The doors were pushed open with a sharp, uncompromising force that demanded absolute attention. Two imposing figures strode into the cavernous room. They were not wearing expensive custom-tailored Italian wool or flashing $1,000 watches. They wore dark utilitarian suits, their expressions carved from pure, unyielding authority. The metallic gleam of badges clipped to their belts caught the morning sunlight, instantly vaporizing whatever lingering illusions Carter harbored about salvaging his career. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted violently from a high-stakes corporate tribunal to an active federal crime scene. Carter Gallagher, the lead agent, announced, his voice a flat, booming baritone that echoed with absolute finality off the glass walls. He did not ask a question. He delivered a statement of fact. He closed the distance between the doors and the podium with rapid, purposeful strides, his partner flanking him seamlessly. Carter took a pathetic, trembling step backward, bumping hard against the digital display screen. The fabricated numbers of his fraudulent empire projected directly onto the back of his sweat-drenched suit. "No," he whispered, the sound barely escaping his lips. "No, wait. You do not understand. I am the senior vice president here. You cannot do this. Let me call my lawyers." The lead agent did not even pause his stride. He reached Carter, grabbing the executive by his tailored shoulder and spinning him around with a practiced, forceful motion that completely dismantled Carter's physical dignity. "You are under arrest for multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, wire fraud, and grand embezzlement." The agent recited, his voice steady and devoid of any emotion. Carter's untouchable ego, the massive inflated balloon of arrogance that had dictated his every action for a decade, shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a strange, high-pitched whimper as the agent forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists resonated through the silent boardroom. It was the sound of absolute finality, the definitive end of the Golden Boy. He writhed weakly against the agent's grip, a pathetic display of resistance that only highlighted how small and powerless he had suddenly become. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued, methodically reading Carter his Miranda rights as he tightened the steel cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Directly behind the podium, the second agent moved purposefully toward Sienna. The fierce survivalist energy she had displayed moments ago when throwing Carter to the wolves entirely evaporated. The realization that betraying her lover had not purchased her immunity struck her with paralyzing force. As the agent reached for her arm, her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her designer ivory dress pooling around her in a crumpled, expensive heap. Sienna dissolved into a messy, hysterical breakdown. She began to sob uncontrollably, her perfectly styled hair falling into her tear-streaked face. She wailed a loud, ugly sound that lacked any trace of her usual practiced refinement, begging the impassive agent to let her go, promising to testify, offering to return the jewelry, desperately trying to barter with a justice system that did not care about her tears. The agent simply hauled her to her feet, his grip unyielding, and secured her wrists behind her back. Carter was forcefully marched away from the podium. He stumbled forward, his polished dress shoes slipping on the floor as the agent guided him down the length of the grand mahogany table. He was paraded directly past the 12 senior executives he had just attempted to manipulate. They sat in stony silence, watching the man they had once considered a brilliant visionary being dragged out like a common street thief. Carter kept his head bowed, his face flushed with the ultimate inescapable humiliation. He did not look at Winston. He did not look at the board. And he certainly did not look at me. Sienna was marched out right behind him, her hysterical sobbing echoing down the long, sterile corridor outside the boardroom as the heavy mahogany doors finally swung shut, sealing them out of the Gallagher Financial empire forever. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut with a definitive, resonant thud, severing the boardroom from the chaotic reality unfolding in the corridor. The silence that reclaimed the executive suite was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of fear and the sudden, undeniable vacuum of power. I did not move from my position beside Winston, nor did I offer any further explanation to the stunned executives. The digital guillotine had dropped, and the execution was complete. But the shockwave of Carter's destruction was not confined to the top floor of Gallagher Financial. It was a highly coordinated, synchronized strike, and the secondary tremors were already tearing across the city, homing in on the specific coordinates of his co-conspirators. 5 miles away, nestled in the heart of the city's most exclusive, brutally expensive shopping district, Chelsea was holding court. Her luxury boutique, a sprawling monument to aesthetic excess and financial ruin, was bathed in the warm, flattering glow of imported track lighting. Racks of bespoke Italian silk and handcrafted Parisian leather lined the polished marble floors, pristine and largely untouched by actual paying customers. Chelsea stood near the front display, a glass of vintage champagne resting casually in her hand. She was loudly berating a junior sales associate over a microscopic smudge on a display mirror, radiating the toxic, entitled arrogance that defined her entire existence. She believed herself to be a brilliant entrepreneur, completely insulated by her family's name and her brother's endless supply of injected capital. She had absolutely no idea that the phantom revenue stream keeping her vanity project afloat had just been severed at the source. The illusion of her success shattered with the screech of heavy tires against the manicured pavement outside. 3 matte black Federal SUVs jumped the curb, blocking the boutique's pristine glass entrance. Before Chelsea could even formulate a thought of indignation, the heavy glass doors were shoved open. A dozen federal agents flooded into the serene, lavender-scented showroom. They did not care about the delicate silk garments or the carefully curated aesthetic. They moved with swift, tactical precision, their dark, tactical vests displaying bold yellow acronyms that instantly drained the color from the faces of the staff and the 2 wealthy patrons browsing the jewelry case. The lead agent, a tall woman with a clipboard and a steely gaze, bypassed the terrified sales associates and marched directly toward Chelsea. She presented a federal search warrant, her voice projecting clearly over the sudden panicked murmurs filling the store. They were authorized to seize all financial records, digital hardware, and physical inventory connected to the suspected laundering of illicit corporate funds. Chelsea dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the imported marble, a sharp, crystalline explosion that mirrored the sudden destruction of her reality. Agents were already unplugging the sleek point-of-sale registers and boxing up the leather-bound client ledgers kept beneath the counter. Pure, unadulterated fury temporarily overrode Chelsea's panic. This was an outrage, a humiliating mistake that needed to be rectified immediately. She spun on her heel, ignoring the agent reading the warrant, and stormed toward her private office at the back of the showroom. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking it against the chaos outside. Her hands shook violently as she snatched her diamond-encrusted smartphone from her desk. She did not dial her brother. She dialed the man she considered her personal, obedient fixer. She dialed her husband. Sitting in the dimly lit, climate-controlled interior of the surveillance van parked beneath the Gallagher Financial Tower, Andre watched his phone illuminate with his wife's contact photo. He had spent the last decade enduring her relentless belittlement, suffering her cruel remarks about his lack of ambition, and silently cataloging every single illicit transaction she pushed through her boutique to clean Carter's stolen money. He pressed the accept button and raised the phone to his ear. He did not say a word, he just listened. "Andre, you need to fix this right now!" Chelsea shrieked into the receiver, her voice a shrill, panicked vibration that forced Andre to hold the device slightly away from his ear. "There are federal agents tearing apart my store. They are boxing up my registers and seizing my inventory. Call the lawyers immediately. I need you to wire the emergency bail funds from the Cayman account. Transfer everything we have into the Domestic Defense Trust. Get down here and handle these thugs before they ruin my brand." She paced the length of her opulent office, her breathing ragged completely, expecting her husband to scramble to apologize, to instantly execute her demands as he always had. She waited for the familiar sound of his compliance. "Chelsea," Andre said. His voice was an arctic calm, devoid of any warmth, completely lacking the subservient tone she demanded. It was the voice of a man who held all the cards. "The question is not what I'm going to do to fix this. It is what you are going to do to survive it." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice pitching higher. "Do your job and fix this." "I cannot do that," he replied smoothly, "because there are no funds to transfer. I froze the offshore accounts an hour ago." The silence on the line was profound, broken only by the muffled sounds of federal agents confiscating computers in the room outside her office. "What do you mean you froze the accounts?" Chelsea asked, her arrogant facade beginning to crack. "I mean the Cayman routing numbers have been seized by the authorities." Andre replied, his words precise and lethal. The emergency corporate credit line Carter tried to open was shut down by the chief risk officer. "You are completely broke, Chelsea. You have absolutely nothing." She gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the room began to spin. Andre did not give her a single second to recover. He drove the final killing blows home with surgical accuracy. "I filed the divorce papers at 9 o'clock this morning." He continued, the quiet satisfaction in his voice, cutting through the digital connection. "Along with the filing, I submitted an emergency ex parte motion for sole legal and physical custody of the children. The judge granted it immediately, citing your imminent federal indictment and the overwhelming flight risk you pose. You will not be coming back to our house. You will not be seeing the kids." A heavy rhythmic pounding began on her locked office door. The federal agents were demanding entry. Chelsea backed away from the wood, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it choked the air from her lungs. "Andre, please," she begged, the entitlement entirely dissolved, replaced by the pathetic pleading of a trapped animal. "Please, you cannot do this. You have to help me. How did they even get the warrant? How do they know about the ledgers?" "I did not just watch you commit fraud for 5 years," Chelsea, Andre stated, delivering the absolute crushing truth. "I documented it. I decrypted your hidden drives. I mapped your entire retail laundering cycle. I personally handed your cooked ledgers, the physical ones you kept locked in your safe, directly to the federal task force yesterday afternoon. They are not guessing. They know everything because I gave them everything." The pounding on the office door turned into a loud, splintering crack as the agents began to breach the lock. "Goodbye, Chelsea," Andre said. The call disconnected with a sharp click. Andre lowered the phone, staring at the dark screen for a long moment before setting it down on the console, finally breathing a lungful of truly free air. In the back office of the ruined boutique, as the heavy oak door burst open and armed federal agents flooded the room with handcuffs drawn, Chelsea dropped the dead phone. She fell to her knees amidst the scattered debris of her shattered life, tilting her head back and releasing a raw, agonizing scream that echoed endlessly into the empty, uncaring void. The echo of Chelsea's despair was miles away, unfolding in a separate theater of destruction. But I could almost feel the satisfying ripple of its impact as I finally stepped out of the Gallagher Financial elevator and into the bustling lobby. The world outside the glass doors continued its frantic, ordinary pace, completely oblivious to the titans that had just been felled 50 stories above. Winston had offered me the use of a private executive suite to decompress, to allow the adrenaline of the boardroom execution to recede, but I declined. I needed to keep moving. I needed to feel the unforgiving pavement beneath my shoes and breathe in the crisp, untainted afternoon air. I walked aimlessly toward the harbor, letting the sheer magnitude of the morning's events settle into my bones. For the first time in a decade, my shoulders were entirely free of the suffocating weight of my husband's expectations. My encrypted phone vibrated against my hip just as I reached the iron railing overlooking the water. The caller ID displayed an unknown string of numbers, followed by a geographic tag indicating a federal holding facility. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, listening to the cry of seagulls and the low hum of ferry engines, before pressing the green icon. An automated, coldly robotic voice informed me that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Detention Center. The system prompted me to accept the charges. With a profound sense of irony, I pressed the button opening the line. The immediate sound that flooded the receiver was not the smooth, commanding baritone of a senior vice president. It was the shrill, ragged, unmistakable sound of a cornered animal gasping for air. It was Carter. He had used his one legally mandated phone call, the single precious lifeline granted to a man who had just watched his entire universe vaporize, to contact the very woman he had spent the last 10 years systematically trying to destroy. He was weeping. It was not a dignified, quiet sorrow, but a loud, messy, pathetic blubbering that echoed harshly against the concrete and steel of whatever holding cell he had been tossed into. He begged me to help him. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic, incoherent rush, tripping over his own sobs as he pleaded for salvation. He begged me to contact my father to leverage my family's remaining connections, to liquidate my personal investment portfolios, to do absolutely whatever it took to post his bail. He cried about the unimaginable indignity of the handcuffs, the terrifying coldness of the cell, and the sheer paralyzing horror of the federal charges hanging over his head. He desperately tried to invoke the ghost of our marriage, weaponizing the very vows he had relentlessly violated. He sobbed about our 10 years together, pleading with me to remember the good times, the early days before the money and the ambition had poisoned everything. He begged for a second chance, making frantic, empty promises that he could fix everything, that he would sever all ties with Sienna, that he would become the husband I had always wanted if I just gave him the capital to secure his freedom. He was relying on the old dynamic banking, on the submissive, compliant wife he thought he had trained me to be. I stood perfectly still by the railing, watching the gray water churn against the concrete pylons. I listened to his hysterical breakdown, letting the sheer, unfiltered desperation wash over me without absorbing a single drop of his panic. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional reaction. I simply waited until his breathless, pathetic hiccups replaced his frantic pleas. When the line finally went quiet, save for his ragged breathing, I spoke. My voice was as calm, flat, and unforgiving as a sheet of winter ice. I did not address his apologies or his promises. Instead, I transported him back to the charity gala, to the exact moment he had sealed his own fate. I reminded him of the vicious, bruising grip he had kept on my arm, the cold cruelty in his eyes, and the harsh whisper he had forced into my ear before abandoning me to parade his mistress around the ballroom. "Do not embarrass me, Carter," I recited, delivering his own toxic command back to him with chilling precision. "You are embarrassing yourself right now." He sputtered, letting out a confused, wet gasp as he tried to pivot his defense, but I cut him off seamlessly. It was time to deliver the final crushing payoff of the entire operation, the masterstroke he had unwittingly helped me execute. I asked him if he remembered the expedited divorce papers he had so eagerly signed a mere 48 hours ago. I reminded him of the predatory, ironclad separation clause his own high-priced legal team had drafted at his explicit instruction. It was the clause designed to completely sever our assets, to protect his stolen offshore millions, and to leave me walking away from a decade of marriage with absolutely nothing. He choked out a confused, trembling affirmative, clearly not understanding how his own malice was about to become his executioner. I explained the legal reality of his greed with surgical, devastating accuracy. Because he had been so arrogant, so desperate to protect his fabricated empire and ensure his future with Sienna remained untouched, he had legally established a complete, impenetrable wall between our financial liabilities. If we had remained legally entangled, the federal authorities might have possessed the jurisdiction to seize shared marital assets to cover the massive shortfall. But he had signed the papers. He had rushed the process. Therefore, I informed him coldly, the $8 million in corporate restitution he now legally owed to Gallagher Financial fell entirely exclusively on his shoulders. The government could not touch a single cent of my independent accounts, my business revenue, or my family's trust to cover his spectacular crimes. He had no shared assets to drain, no marital safety net to fall back on, and zero access to the offshore ghost accounts I had already burned to the ground. His attempt to leave me destitute was the exact mechanism that shielded me and doomed him. He was solely responsible for the restitution, the exorbitant legal defense fees, and the impending federal fines. He was in every conceivable metric financially ruined for the rest of his natural life. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait to hear the agonizing, terrified wail that was undoubtedly building in his throat as the absolute finality of his destruction settled over him. I simply pressed the red button, cutting the line dead, and dropped the encrypted phone into the deep pocket of my coat. I turned my back to the harbor and walked away, stepping into the rest of my life. 6 months later, the suffocating summer heat that had defined the day of the boardroom execution had completely faded, replaced by the crisp, biting winds of a new winter. The dust from the catastrophic implosion of Carter's fabricated empire had finally settled, leaving a radically altered landscape in its wake. The swift, brutal efficiency of the federal justice system had processed the undeniable digital evidence with ruthless speed. There were no prolonged trials, no dramatic courtroom battles, and no high-priced defense attorneys capable of untangling the forensic web I had woven around them. Faced with the absolute certainty of the server logs, the offshore routing data, and the security footage, both Carter and Sienna had been forced to accept plea deals that guaranteed them lengthy stays in federal custody. Carter's current reality was a stark, jarring contrast to the bespoke luxury he had once demanded as his birthright. He was housed in a medium-security federal penitentiary, his identity permanently reduced to an inmate number stitched onto a standard-issue khaki uniform. The man who had once obsessed over the precise cut of his Italian wool suits and the vintage of his boardroom scotch now spent his days navigating the rigid, unforgiving schedule of the prison laundry facility. His untouchable ego had been entirely hollowed out, replaced by the crushing, inescapable weight of the $8 million in corporate restitution he legally owed. He was a financial ghost, entirely bankrupt, with a decade-long sentence stretching out before him, and absolute ruin waiting for him on the outside. Sienna fared no better. Relocated to a separate federal women's facility, the pristine, polished veneer of the ambitious executive assistant had been completely stripped away. The designer dresses, the illicit diamonds, and the carefully curated aesthetic had all been seized as proceeds of a financial crime. She was isolated, entirely cut off from the high society world she had so desperately tried to steal her way into. Her attempts to leverage her charm and manipulative tactics proved entirely useless in an environment that ran on rigid compliance and ironclad routines. The glittering future she had envisioned alongside Carter had dissolved into the bleak, monotonous reality of concrete walls and steel doors. The collateral damage of their arrogance extended far beyond the prison walls, striking Chelsea with equal devastation. The federal raid on her luxury boutique had been the final fatal blow to her carefully maintained illusion of superiority. The money laundering scandal instantly obliterated her brand, transforming her from a celebrated socialite into a toxic pariah. The very people who had once clamored for invitations to her exclusive events completely severed ties, treating her name like a contagious disease. Facing massive IRS penalties and the total seizure of her business assets, Chelsea was forced into a humiliating, highly publicized bankruptcy. She had been evicted from her sprawling gated mansion, relegated to a cramped, unremarkable apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely abandoned by the social circle she had spent her life cultivating. In profound contrast to the wreckage of the Gallagher family, Andre had engineered a spectacular resurrection. He walked through the glass doors of the Gallagher Financial Tower, not as a marginalized, disrespected spouse, but as the newly appointed lead auditor. Recognizing his meticulous attention to detail and his unparalleled forensic accounting skills, I had personally recruited him to oversee the integrity of my division. He thrived in the role his brilliant mind finally recognized, respected, and compensated appropriately. More importantly, he had legally secured full sole custody of his children. He had relocated them to a quiet, beautiful home in a thriving neighborhood building, a serene, joyful environment completely eradicated of Chelsea's toxic, narcissistic demands. He was a man who had quietly gathered the stones thrown at him and used them to build an impenetrable fortress for his family. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my new penthouse corner office, the cold winter wind whipping my hair across my face. I gripped the thick glass railing, looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the late afternoon sun painted the skyscrapers in brilliant shades of gold and copper. The ambient hum of the metropolis drifted up from the streets far below, a constant rhythmic reminder of the world moving forward. Behind me, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, my division hummed with legitimate, transparent productivity, governed by the secure algorithms I had built and perfected. I was no longer the embarrassed, invisible wife hiding in the shadows of a charismatic fraud. I had stopped folding myself into small, quiet shapes to accommodate the fragile, inflated ego of a man who viewed my intellect as a threat. The decade I had spent shrinking my own brilliance, silencing my own voice to keep the peace in a fundamentally broken marriage felt like a lifetime ago. I had finally realized that diminishing your own light to keep someone else comfortable is a profound betrayal of the self. My mind, my capability, and my relentless drive were not liabilities to be hidden away. They were the very tools I had used to engineer my own rescue. I had navigated the treacherous, shark-infested waters of corporate treason and personal betrayal, and I had not merely survived the storm. I had commanded it. I was the master of my own empire, standing entirely on ground of my own making, completely free from the suffocating weight of anyone else's expectations. The journey from the shadows to the penthouse had been agonizing, but it had forged an unbreakable armor. The experience taught me that true power does not come from proximity to someone else's success, nor does it come from sacrificing your identity to maintain a comfortable illusion. True power is recognizing your own inherent value, refusing to be dismissed, and having the courage to tear down a toxic reality to build something authentic in its place. Have you ever found yourself shrinking your own potential to protect the fragile ego of someone you loved? Have you ever had to gather the courage to walk away from a toxic dynamic and rebuild your life entirely on your own terms? Share your stories of resilience and reclaiming your power in the comments section below. If this journey of exposing narcissism and finding ultimate vindication resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about individuals finding the strength to step out of the shadows and take back control of their lives. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your brilliance is never something to be hidden. The story powerfully illustrates that true self-worth can never be built in the shadow of someone else's fragile ego. For years, Gwen silenced her brilliance to maintain a toxic marriage, mistakenly believing that shrinking herself would keep the peace. The ultimate lesson here is that diminishing your own light to make others comfortable is a profound betrayal of yourself. Reclaiming your power requires the courage to dismantle comfortable illusions and step confidently into your own truth without ever apologizing for your inherent strength. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic dynamic to rediscover your true self, please share your experiences in the comments below.